My sister has been missing for almost 5 days now. She's got a 13-year-old daughter, and we are worried sick.
There was more to this than just a missing persons case.
There's no way. She is not leaving her daughter.
That was very concerning to me.
We're certain that some type of foul play has been involved.
CCTV played a massive role in this case. We knew that they were lying because of the CCTV.
All I want to do is find her, and I want to give you a chance to dig yourself out of this hole.
37-year-old Marilee Cox Lafferty prepares for a 900-mile road trip from her home in California to Utah.
I met Marilee when we were teenagers. We went to a counseling group together. She was a misfit, and she was funny, and she was hardworking.
Marilee hopes to rekindle a romance with an old flame.
I knew the person that she was seeing was Rob Willis. She had known him since she was very young, about 16.
Honey, are you ready?
Marilee's 13-year-old daughter, Shayna, is coming with her.
They sure were always together. Very rarely were they separated. She was a really good mom.
Marilee wants to build a better future for herself after a lifetime of challenges.
Over the years, Marilee struggled with a bunch of battles. She was very open about them as well. She struggled with anxiety and depression and addiction.
She was a severe alcoholic. They said that she would have died if she wouldn't have quit drinking.
From that point on, after she went through recovery, I was so proud of Marilee when she had done the work that she needed to do to get sober.
That's a good girl. Come on.
Her service dog, Coco, will be traveling by her side.
She was epileptic. She would black out and have full-on grand mal seizures. They had her on a lot of different medications.
So she got Coco, a dog that could help if something happened to her. Marilee was just trying to figure out how she could both live with this condition and also be the sole provider for her daughter. That was her #1 priority.
This is Christy. Hi, ma'am. My name's Shawnee Weissman, and my sister has been missing for almost 5 days now. The last she was in the Logan, Utah area. She's got a 13-year-old daughter, and we are worried sick.
The person that reported Marilee missing was her friend, who she referred to as kind of her sister. Her name is Shawnee.
Does she live here, or? No, she lives in California. She was visiting friends there in Logan, Utah. I don't know the address. And you don't know what she was doing here? She was helping a friend move. Her friend brought her daughter to me in Idaho.
Shawnee reported that Marilee had a daughter that had been taken to Shawnee by Rob Willis. Shawnee was worried about Marilee because she had a past with alcohol and drugs, and she was worried that Marilee had relapsed.
We've got missing persons.
When this was passed to Logan PD, this was given to me to be the lead investigator into the missing persons case for Marilee Cox Lafferty.
We have somebody that's possibly under the influence and driving a vehicle on the roadways. We entered Marilee into a nationwide database for missing persons. Same thing for her vehicle, a gold Toyota Camry with California license plates.
We're going to need to get statements from the family.
Detectives speak with Marilee's brother, Daryl, to get more information.
I had spoken with Shawnee. She said that Rob and Marilee had an argument. She had taken a handful of Klonopin and moonshine and left in her car, left her daughter and everything.
She would never run off like this.
I immediately felt like there was more to this than just a missing persons case. We had heard that Marilee had taken some drugs and alcohol and just disappeared.
Marilee had reportedly been sober for 9 years.
After rehab, she never touched anything ever again. There's no way. She's not grabbing a bottle, and she's not leaving her daughter. She was very protective of her.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
The thing that really stuck out to me initially was that her daughter was left behind. That didn't make a lot of sense to me. That was very concerning to me.
Investigators focused next on the man Marilee drove to Utah to visit, Rob Willis.
Marilee had come from California with her daughter to visit Rob Willis here in Hiram, which is a town just south of Logan.
Detective Woods, you Rob Willis?
That's me.
Rob told us that Marilee had come to help him move stuff into his new house. He said that she had been there on August 17th and August 18th. She had her daughter with her and her dog. At some point, they got into an argument about their relationship.
Rob said that Marilee wanted to be intimate with him, and he declined. He and Marilee had been arguing all night, and the argument continued in the morning. They went to Shane's house, where they dropped off Marilee's daughter.
Who's Shane?
Rob tells detectives that Shane Miles is his friend and co-worker.
The argument that happened between he and Marilee was outside Shane's apartment in the parking lot. Marilee had reportedly threatened to drink a bunch of alcohol and take her medication in order to end her life.
He said Marilee was very angry. She was yelling at him.
Rob and Shane had to go to work, and they were going to be late, so they left.
Whose car did you leave in?
Mine. It's right there.
And they both left for work in Rob's vehicle, which is a green Isuzu Trooper.
Rob says he believed that Marilee, her daughter and Coco, would be gone by the time he and Shane returned from work.
After he left Marilee, he clocked into work at 3:42 p.m., and he was at work until he got off later that night around midnight.
Rob states that he kept getting text messages from her that were of a harassing nature because she was so angry with him.
When they went back to Shane's house, Marilee's vehicle was gone, but that Marilee's daughter was there at Shane's apartment.
They were both very surprised that Marilee's daughter was still there.
The day after Marilee's disappearance on August 19th, Rob took Marilee's daughter up to Idaho to be with Shawnee.
Look at this.
And we noticed that the back window on Rob's vehicle on the driver's side had been broken. It had glass in the back of the vehicle still, but it was kind of like he had covered it with some plastic sheeting.
What happened to the car?
He said he had backed into a tree while camping.
It happened after she disappeared.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Investigators contact Rob's friend, Shane. He volunteers for an interview at the police department.
It's very important that we speak with Shane to see what he has to tell us, to compare that with what Rob is telling us.
All right, Shane, so obviously the reason we're talking to you today is trying to find out what happened to her, okay? Tell me what you know about her.
So I met her on Friday. She came with Rob.
Shane had not met Marilee until she had come to Utah to visit with Rob.
Second time when she come, she stayed out in the car, but then she got out and she come to my door and just hollering, just weird crap like, F you this, F you that.
And when was this?
This was Saturday. The last time when she come to my house, she was outside yelling.
Shane told me that he had told Rob that she can't be acting like that because he'll get in trouble with his landlord and the neighbors. They both stated that the last time they saw her was in the parking lot outside Shane's house, and that they went to work in Rob's green Isuzu Trooper.
Did you go together?
Yeah, we ride together.
Did you see Marilee leave?
No, I was in the house.
His story matched Rob's.
Investigators contact hospitals and local law enforcement to check if Marilee is receiving treatment or in custody.
We found that Marilee had not been to any hospitals in the area, and based on what we could see, she had not been arrested anywhere in the country. So we generated a missing persons flyer that we posted on our Logan City Police Department social media.
Detective Woods.
I received a phone call from one of our lieutenants.
Somebody had located a dog that was wandering around Logan City.
And they started getting messages from Marilee's family members that this dog that we had collected on the 18th of August was Marilee's dog, Coco.
That was concerning because her family reported Marilee would never leave her dog, that dog was always by her side.
Where exactly did you say you found the dog?
That this dog that we had collected was found at TTM Technologies.
TTM Technologies is a company that manufactures electronic components.
There's no real connection to Marilee.
We went to TTM and we asked for surveillance video.
We knew the dog was on film at about 4:42 p.m. What we're hoping to find on this camera is how the dog got to TTM.
Hold it. That's Coco.
We first saw the dog on the camera at 4:42 p.m. on August 18th. The dog is just running around the parking lot like it was by itself. We know Marilee shouldn't have been far away from there, but it didn't seem like Marilee was close by based on the way the dog was acting. A little bit later, the person that had found the dog, we see them pull up in a vehicle, and then we see that person pick up the dog and leave.
Investigators review the footage from TTM's other surveillance cameras to trace Coco's movements before she is found.
At 4:24 p.m., we see the dog sniffing around one of the exterior doors close up to the building.
Do that again.
We still haven't seen anything on camera besides the dog, and so we keep working backwards to see, is there any more surveillance footage that might show something? We see somebody enter the frame wearing a dark shirt, walk towards the door, and someone follows right behind him wearing a white shirt. And as they open the door and enter the building, they both kind of look back.
You can see that it is both Shane and Rob that are on video.
And then just seconds later is when we see the dog follow right behind them. TTM is where Shane Miles and Rob Willis worked. So it was not suspicious that we saw Rob and Shane on the camera footage there at work.
But what was unusual is that Marilee's dog was also on video in proximity to them. That information was crucial. How was the dog located at the workplace for Rob and Shane when Rob had told us that the dog had gone with Marilee?
We start to think maybe Rob and Shane know more information than what they're telling us, and we need to keep looking into that.
Both Rob and Shane told investigators they arrived at work shortly after 3:40 p.m., 1 hour before Coco is found at TTM.
They didn't leave work at all for the duration of their shift until sometime around midnight.
The investigators review the TTM parking lot footage from 3:40 p.m. to pinpoint Rob and Shane's arrival.
That's them.
At 3:46, we see Shane and Rob walking through the parking lot towards the building.
Roll backwards.
We then want to see them enter the parking lot to see what vehicle they're in.
So Rob and Shane had told us that they had come to work in Rob's green Isuzu Trooper, but we didn't see his vehicle. Jump back. At 3:46 p.m., we see a black Ford Mustang.
Can't be sure it's them. Is there a camera on the back lot?
You can follow it on video through the parking lot all the way to the point to where they park.
Play on. Freeze there.
We could see Shane and Rob exit the Mustang.
When we saw that they had arrived in Shane's Mustang and not in Rob's Trooper, we weren't quite sure what to think of that, and so we needed to investigate that further. They both told us they were at work and didn't leave, so we want to watch and see if that's another thing that they're misleading us on.
Fast forward.
We carried on watching it because we knew the dog had arrived at that building.
At 4:06 p.m., we see them leave the parking lot driving Shane's vehicle.
This directly contradicts what they both told us, that they had never left work that day.
And so we start to wonder, where are they going?
Approximately 20 minutes after they left work that afternoon, they arrived back in Shane's black Ford Mustang. They park in a different spot this time, and that spot is not actually on camera. So we're not able to see them exit the vehicle at that time. However, within seconds after parking, we do pick them up on surveillance again, walking on TTM property. But this time, the dog is within feet of them.
It is very, very suspicious that they have the dog, but Marilee's nowhere to be seen. We have two people that know something that they're not telling us.
We knew they were lying, and we knew that we had to build a case.
On September 1st, we got some information back from Marilee's cell phone provider showing her most recent cell phone locations.
What have we got? Can you pull that up on a map?
One of the ping locations that we got on Marilee's cell phone was at 1:31 p.m. on August 18th, the day that she went missing. And it showed in the area of Blacksmith Fork Canyon, which is near Rob's residence.
What about the later ping?
One of the other cell phone ping locations we had on Marilee's cell phone was at 2:16 p.m. in the area of 1700 South, the US 8991 highway intersection, which is in Logan, near Shane's apartment. The second cell phone ping was suspicious to us because it was in the city where there is good cell phone service. It's possible that her phone could have died, but Rob also told us that she had been sending him text messages later in the day. And so the fact that 2:16 p.m. is her final cell phone ping is again another inconsistency with what Rob is telling us. It made us believe that something was seriously wrong with her.
The feeling I had was something sinister had happened. I believe Marilee was no longer alive.
Our biggest lead at this time would be Rob and Shane. Up until that point, they've shown that they're not willing to tell us the truth. They're willing to mislead us on certain things. So we start to conduct surveillance on Shane and Rob.
Investigators secure permission to attach a covert GPS tracker to Rob's vehicle.
What we were hoping to obtain by placing the tracker on Rob's vehicle were his movements. Where was he going? Did he have somewhere that might lead us to Marilee? And that's what we really wanted to know. On the evening of September 8th, I was contacted by our on-duty patrol supervisor. He informed me that Marilee's vehicle had been found in Boise, Idaho, near the airport.
We did confirm that her vehicle was located at an extended stay hotel in Boise, Idaho, which from Logan, Utah is about a 5 or a 6 hour drive.
When I got that call, it was actually exhilarating because I knew that we had our vehicle. We had this huge piece of evidence we'd been looking for. Unfortunately, they did not have surveillance of their parking lot. So we don't know how the vehicle got there or who parked it there.
Some of Marilee's family did live in Idaho, not too far from that area. And so we thought maybe she had driven up that way because she had family or friends up there that she wanted to visit. So we talked with Marilee's brother up in Idaho.
When I heard that the vehicle was found, a tinge of hope kind of goes through you, like, okay, maybe she was coming back.
Is there any sign of her yet?
But it didn't add up that she would go back to Boise, she would leave her daughter and her dog even, and then also not try to get in contact with her family.
No, I haven't heard from her at all.
When she'd come to visit in town, she would visit everybody while she was here.
No one had seen her. No one had talked to her.
Investigators received data from the tracker they attached to Rob's vehicle.
On September 7th, we saw that Rob took a trip in his vehicle up into the mountains. That was of interest to us because one of the last cell phone pings from Marilee's cell phone was near the base of one of the canyons.
Marilee's been missing for over 3 weeks. We know there's been no movement on any of her records. The GPS information gave us that he was in the canyon for approximately 3 hours. It can tell us exactly everywhere he stopped.
One of the locations where Rob had stopped at the longest, I think he was in that area for about 23 minutes. So following Rob's trip into the mountains, we took our own trip up there. We found broken glass that looked like it might have been from a vehicle window. Rob told us he'd gone on a camping trip after Marilee's disappearance into the mountains, and that it was on that camping trip that his vehicle window got broken. Maybe it did happen after Marilee disappeared, but maybe it also had something to do with her disappearance, and maybe this is where she was last seen.
We went and thoroughly searched to see if we could find any sign of Marilee or any kind of evidence that would lead us to where she might be. Unfortunately, though, we found no evidence of Marilee. We know that her phone pinged outside Blacksmith Fork Canyon, and then shortly after, it pinged at 1700 South, a known route that Rob used, and that it never had activity again.
One of the businesses along that route was a gas station that had surveillance cameras.
Detectives secure CCTV footage from the gas station for August 18th. They review it at the police department.
The camera angle that we obtained from Maverick mainly shows their parking lot and their gas pumps. But in the very top of the camera angle, you can see the Highway 165. And so we're really only focused on that top part of the camera angle.
It takes a lot of manpower to go through hours of video for what you end up finding is just small sections, maybe seconds or possibly minutes of video you actually need.
At 10:50, we see Rob's Isuzu Trooper travel south.
The driver was wearing a white t-shirt, which is what Rob was wearing as he entered TTM to go to work later on that day.
He's traveling towards Hiram. He lives in Hiram, so it's possible he's going towards his house, but he's also going towards the area near the mouth of Blacksmith Fork Canyon.
We continue to scour the surveillance video for that morning.
Jump back.
At 2:13 p.m., we see Rob's vehicle on the surveillance footage show up. This time it's traveling north on Highway 165 past the Maverick. Whether Marilee is in the vehicle or not, we don't know, but we don't see her vehicle at all in the surveillance footage. We know that Marilee's cell phone pinged at 2:16, about 3 minutes north of where we saw his vehicle on surveillance. We know that most likely her cell phone is in that vehicle.
Punch in on the back of the car.
The quality is not very good, but we're able to see the windows on the vehicle, whether there's a reflection. At 10:50, we can see that the window on his Trooper is intact. At 2:13 p.m., when it goes back the other way, the window looks completely different. You know, there's no reflection at all. We're able to see that the window on his vehicle is now smashed. Rob was lying to us. His vehicle window was damaged and broken the day of Marilee's disappearance.
What happened to Rob's vehicle? Why did this window become broken in this time frame? How did it get broken? We know that just shortly after this, within minutes, Marilee's phone no longer has activity.
We keep watching the surveillance footage to see what else we might find.
Show that again.
And at about 2:55 p.m., we see Rob's vehicle again past the Maverick.
Punch in.
He's traveling south towards his home in Hiram.
We know that he was at work about an hour after that. We know that Rob most likely will pass through again on his way back to Logan, where he goes to work later. At 3:09 p.m., we see Rob's vehicle again travel north past the Maverick.
Go closer.
This time, though, there's something different. We can see that the driver is not wearing a white shirt. The driver is wearing a darker colored shirt.
Stop.
Just a few seconds later, we see a vehicle that looks like a gold Toyota Camry. It looks like Marilee's vehicle, and it passes north, almost directly behind Rob's vehicle. Rob told us that he last saw Marilee and the vehicle in Logan at Shane's apartment.
Punch in.
The thing about that gold Camry that we saw was the driver was wearing a white shirt. So we were very suspicious that Rob was driving Marilee's vehicle at that time. The driver of Rob's vehicle was wearing a dark shirt. We were almost certain that it was Shane driving the vehicle because we had Shane on surveillance later that day wearing a dark shirt.
So where is Marilee?
We didn't see anything that would indicate there was a passenger in either vehicle. However, we couldn't be certain just because of the quality of the video.
Marilee has been missing for 3 weeks. Her friends and family struggle to come to terms with her disappearance.
It was a constant battle where you knew something was very wrong, very bad, but you still want to try to convince yourself that this still could be okay. I was cautious of Rob from the very beginning. She had told me about how he was abusive, both verbal and attempts at physical abuse.
Rob didn't sound right, and she could do 100% better. And then when she came up missing, that was just my gut went straight to that guy did something to her.
At this point in the investigation, we're almost certain that some type of foul play has been involved, that she's no longer alive. We had evidence against Rob, but we also had evidence against Shane, who is most likely to tell us the truth.
Investigators invite Shane to the police department for a second time.
We determined that Shane, if we confronted him with the evidence, that he most likely would help us with the investigation.
So did you guys take Rob's car to work that day?
Rob's vehicle.
Did you ever leave work at all?
No.
Shane again stuck to his story that they left in Rob's green Isuzu Trooper, which we knew was a false statement. He said that they had arrived at work and they had never left, which we knew was a false statement. Shane said that he had never known about Marilee's dog or that she even had a dog, which clearly we knew was a false statement.
I see Shane was covering for Rob. Because all this stuff you told me today, I can prove that you lied to me.
What do you mean I've lied to you, honestly?
Shane, I know that day that you left TTM. I know that day you were in your vehicle. And I know that you had the dog with you. And that's all on camera.
I began to show still photos from surveillance video to Shane to confront him about his lies.
Whose vehicle was that?
It's my vehicle.
That's the day she went missing.
Okay.
You're in your vehicle. See those times? Those are the times you left work 20 minutes after getting there. And when you returned, Shane?
That's because I go to Paco's Tacos all the time.
You just told me you never left that day. And when you returned, her dog is seen on camera with you and Rob.
It was at this point in time that Shane started to crumble.
I'm trying to be honest with you. I'm just scared what to say because I'm scared he's going to do something to me and my kids. I'm being honest with you.
We're going to help you with that.
Shane was obviously scared. I think he was afraid of Rob Willis and what Rob had committed and entangled Shane in. Shane does admit that he helps Rob move Marilee's vehicle to the Paco's Tacos parking lot, just a few blocks west of TTM.
How did he get rid of her car? What did he tell you? And Shane, if you had a part in that, you need to be honest with me right now.
I'm not. I know he took it down somewhere. I don't know where.
I still needed to know how it got up to Boise. Shane denied moving it to Boise.
Who did he say went with him? Because you can't take two cars that far. I already have the car, Shane. Tell me who it is, Shane.
His name's Jordan.
Jordan?
Mm-hmm.
What's What's Jordan's last name?
I have no idea. I've only met him once.
Shane told us that Jordan had been a coworker with Rob and Shane previously, and that's how he knew him.
Search the database for anybody named Jordan that fits this description.
He did describe some very distinct and unique tattoos that Jordan had on his face.
He's got a rap sheet.
It fits the profile of somebody else that might have been involved in Marilee's disappearance.
It's important at this point in time that we speak to Jordan. Because if Jordan took Marilee's vehicle to Boise, I need to know the circumstances behind that.
Police officers detain Jordan and bring him back to the police department for questioning.
You ever heard the name Marilee Cox Lafferty? I have never heard that name before. She's this missing lady that we've been looking for about a month. You recognize her at all? No, not at all. Never heard that name at all? No, I don't even know how I would be even involved with her. Okay. Well, she had this little gold Toyota. And that's why you're here.
I asked him about his involvement with Rob Willis.
You ever been up to Boise with him? I did. I took a trip with him up to Boise. When was that? 4 weeks ago. How'd you get there? I drove his girlfriend's car up there. Okay. Because right now he's implicated you in the murder. Implicated me? By moving her car. And that's why I'm trying to figure out how deeply you're involved.
Rob told him it was a girlfriend's vehicle and he was just going to go drop it off for him and that Rob would pick him up in Boise. We knew that Rob was the one responsible for Marilee's death, and he had used these other people to help cover up his crime. At that point in time, the only thing I could think about was that we needed to pick up Rob. We couldn't have him out in public any longer.
And all I want to do is find her, let her daughter bury her mother. And I want to give you a chance to dig yourself out of this hole.
So you want me to get from Rob anything I can get? Is that what you're asking?
I want you to tell me the truth about everything right now.
Tell you the truth about what?
About what you know.
I don't know anything. Rob doesn't tell me.
Detective Woods turns up the heat to get Shane to reveal what happened to Marilee.
Where is she, Shane?
She's here.
Where?
Up the canyon somewhere.
Were you there?
No.
Who was with him when he did it?
He's by himself. He was with her.
How'd he kill her?
I think he beat her to death.
Did he say with what?
Just said things like this.
At this point, when Shane tells us this, that's our biggest piece of evidence that we're looking for. Shane led us to a location up Blacksmith Fork Canyon near a pretty remote camping site. I was very hopeful that this would be the end of the investigation.
Shane said that Rob had taken him up there to the specific point and said, she's down there. He believed that this was a scare tactic, that, look, if you tell anybody, this is what's going to happen to you as well.
In the immediate area of the campsite, there was a tree, and underneath the tree, there was a lot of broken glass.
There was also glass embedded in a tree branch that was the same height, relatively, as Rob's vehicle.
Also in this area was a bracelet that had the scorpion charm on it, and I knew that Marilee was a Scorpio, and so I was pretty certain that was her bracelet.
I went downhill. I'm looking around, I'm trying to find anything, when I get the distinct odor of decomposition. I start moving towards what I see as an unnatural rock formation underneath a tree. We moved one rock and we could see a human foot underneath the rock pile. And we knew that we had found Marilee finally.
I don't think anyone's ever prepared to come across human remains like that. Marilee had been in the mountains, buried up there for about a month.
Marilee was able to be identified positively by her fingerprints.
Marilee's daughter was staying at my house. I just told her that they found her and that she was dead. And she screamed, and she just curled in a ball and cried and cried and cried. It broke my heart so much.
I remember when I got the phone call that they had found her and confirming everything that I didn't want confirmed. That was one of the hardest days of my life, to have to come to reality that she was gone.
I wanted to hold her hand. I wanted to be a big sister, and I wanted to take it away. I would have traded her places in a heartbeat because she fought so hard to be the better person that she was being.
Rob Willis was placed under arrest in Hiram by a SWAT team on the afternoon of September 14th. I knew I had another large task in front of me in trying to get some sort of confession from Rob.
How much do you care about her? That's what I was thinking about, starting a life with her.
Was that before you killed her?
What?
Is that before you killed her, Rob?
I didn't kill her.
You did. Rob, and we're gonna prove it.
I didn't think he would tell me much. When I tried to confront him, he still deflected.
We found her.
And?
And your DNA is gonna be on her, Rob. I know you killed her, Rob. You know,
I didn't kill her.
I think you just lost control.
When I finally told him that we had recovered Marilee and confronted him and told him that we knew he was responsible, Rob requested an attorney. And at that point, the interrogation ended.
Take me to jail. I'm done.
You can sit down a little bit.
Investigators piece together the events they believe led to Marilee's murder.
Rob and Marilee are arguing about their relationship and then went for a drive and went up into the mountains.
We believe Rob entered the canyon area with Marilee and her dog in Rob's vehicle. At some point in time, there is a fight that occurs. Rob's window became broken.
We're still not certain exactly how Rob killed Marilee, but it was most likely due to some blunt force trauma. Rob had then moved a lot of rocks to cover up her body. Once Rob killed Marilee, he left the mountains.
He returns to Shane's house and he tells Shane what he did.
So he now has to cover up what happened. At that point, Rob realized Marilee's car is at his house.
We then know that him and Shane left Shane's house to go back out to Hiram.
They take Marilee's car, Shane driving Rob's vehicle and Rob driving Marilee's vehicle.
Rob dumps Marilee's car at Paco's Tacos with Marilee's dog, Coco, inside it. Rob and Shane then drive to work in Shane's Mustang.
20 or 30 minutes after arriving, they left TTM on the way to Paco's Tacos to get Marilee's dog from the vehicle.
And they arrived back at TTM a short time later now with Marilee's dog.
And then the next day, Rob took Marilee's daughter up to be with Shawnee. Rob threatened Jordan to get him to cooperate so that Jordan would drive Marilee's vehicle from Logan up to Boise, Idaho to dispose of it up there, most likely trying to throw us off the track, trying to make us think that Marilee had driven up there to see family. I think Rob did believe that he was going to get away with it because he had tried to dispose of all the evidence. We were not able to prove that Jordan intentionally obstructed the investigation by moving Marilee's vehicle. With Shane, we knew that he had intentionally misled us and obstructed the investigation, but we also had a reasonable belief that Rob had threatened his life and threatened him to participate with the obstruction.
Shane was a very key witness to this homicide investigation and directly responsible for our recovery of her body. Rob never would have told us that.
Jordan Larson and Shane Miles are charged with no crimes in relation to Marilee's death. Rob Willis pleads guilty to first-degree felony murder. He is sentenced to 15 years to life.
CCTV played a massive role in this case. As soon as we knew that the dog was located on that footage, we knew that they were lying because of the CCTV. And from there, we were able to build a case and build it with more CCTV. Bringing the dog back to TTM was a crucial misstep on his part.
Every day when I see something beautiful in nature, I think about her. I think about her, wanting to get her camera out and take a picture of it and to preserve that memory. I miss talking to her, and
the rain in Seattle does not just fall. It bleeds into the pavement, washing away secrets, dampening the screams of the night, and burying the truth beneath a permanent sheen of cold, gray moisture. On the night of October 12th, 1993, the neon signs of the Capitol Hill neighborhood blurred through a heavy downpour, casting long, fractured shadows across the oil-slicked asphalt of the narrow alleys behind the historic brick apartment complexes. Inside a cozy, third-floor studio on East Harrison Street, 22-year-old aspiring photojournalist Claire Montgomery was organizing her latest darkroom prints, the rhythmic ticking of her wall clock matching the steady patter of water against her windowpane. The jazz record spinning on her turntable hummed softly, a warm contrast to the freezing Pacific Northwest wind howling outside, masking the sound of a heavy footstep landing on the metal fire escape just beyond her kitchen window. It was a calculated, completely silent entry, executed with the terrifying confidence of a predator who had stalked this specific target for weeks, watching her through the lens of her own vulnerability. By 2 a.m., the music had stopped, replaced by a suffocating, violent silence that settled over the room like a heavy shroud, a silence that would remain unbroken for over 3 decades. When her younger brother arrived the following afternoon to check on her after she failed to show up for a major gallery exhibition, he walked into a living nightmare that would permanently shatter his sanity and alter the landscape of the city's collective consciousness. Claire lay in the center of her living room floor, her camera strap tightly wrapped around her throat, her lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling as if still trying to capture the final, horrific image of her killer's face. The apartment was entirely undisturbed, with no signs of forced entry, no missing valuables, and no physical evidence left behind, save for a single, chilling anomaly. Every single photograph featuring a human face had been neatly excised from her portfolio with a razor blade, leaving behind nothing but empty, black frames that mocked the responding homicide detectives. The immediate aftermath of the discovery hit the Pacific Northwest like an earthquake, sending a shockwave of raw panic through the artistic and bohemian communities of Seattle, a city already reeling from the darker undercurrents of the early 1990s counterculture. The local news stations instantly labeled the tragedy the clipped frame homicide, with anchorpersons broadcasting from the rain-soaked streets of Capitol Hill, their voices trembling as they described the unprecedented cruelty of a killer who collected his victim's work as a trophy. Police cruisers choked the narrow street, their flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet brick walls, casting an eerie, chaotic glow over the hundreds of shocked students and artists who gathered behind the yellow crime scene tape, whispering in fear. Claire Montgomery was a rising star in the underground art scene, known for her raw, candid street photography that captured the hidden pain and beauty of Seattle's homeless youth and late-night drifters. The absolute precision of the crime scene suggested that she had either known her attacker or had unwittingly captured something, or someone, lethal on her camera roll, transforming her passion into her own execution warrant. Forensic investigators combed every square inch of the hardwood floors, vacuumed the carpets for trace fibers, and dusted the darkroom equipment for latent fingerprints, but the perpetrator had operated with an almost supernatural cleanliness. It was as if a phantom had materialized from the freezing fog, systematically extinguished a brilliant young life, stolen the only evidence of his identity, and dissolved back into the pouring rain without leaving a single microscopic footprint behind. Lead Detective Robert Vance, a hardened 20-year veteran of the Seattle Police Department's homicide unit, stood in the center of the apartment, his trench coat soaked, his mind twisting under the immense weight of a crime that offered absolutely no logical starting point. He spent hours examining the empty photograph frames, his instinct telling him that the key to the entire mystery lay within the silver halide images that had been stolen from the room. The killer had not just taken the prints. He had gone into the darkroom and taken the specific negatives matching those shots, a level of forensic awareness that indicated a highly disciplined, deeply paranoid mind. Vance ordered a total, exhaustive audit of Claire's recent movements, dispatching teams of plainclothes officers to interview every bartender, barista, street musician, and transient she had photographed in the months leading up to October 1993. They logged thousands of hours of overtime, chasing rumors through the crowded grunge clubs of Pioneer Square and the shadowy alcoves of Pike Place Market, but every potential lead evaporated into a frustrating dead end of hazy memories and drug-fueled paranoia. The camera itself, a vintage Nikon FM2 that Claire carried everywhere like an extension of her own body, was found sitting on the kitchen counter, completely wiped clean of fingerprints, its film canister ripped open and exposed to the light, destroying whatever final images she had captured in her dying moments. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare against the police, a deliberate statement of superiority from a killer who knew exactly how to blind the investigation from the very start. As the weeks bled into months, the frantic urgency of the initial investigation began to stall against a wall of bureaucratic exhaustion and a complete lack of physical data. The newspaper headlines shifted from front-page hysteria to small, weekly updates buried in the back sections until they eventually stopped altogether, leaving the memory of Claire Montgomery to be swallowed by the relentless march of time. The case file, once a roaring fire of active leads and community outrage, slowly cooled into a heavy, dead weight, bound in faded cardboard boxes and relegated to the bottom drawers of the Seattle Police Department's cold case repository. Year after year, the dust settled thicker on the manila folders, a silent, mounting monument to a failure that would haunt Detective Vance until the day he turned in his badge, his mind forever trapped in that rain-slicked alley on East Harrison Street. The apartment building itself was eventually sold, the walls repainted, the darkroom demolished to make way for a modern luxury kitchen, its subsequent tenants entirely oblivious to the horror that had unfolded on the very floors beneath their feet. Claire's parents passed away in the early 2000s, their hearts broken not just by the loss of their daughter, but by the agonizing, permanent silence of a justice system that had seemingly abandoned her ghost to the dark archives of the forgotten. The world transitioned from analog to digital, the grain of film replaced by the clinical perfection of pixels, and the clipped-frame homicide became nothing more than an urban legend whispered by young counterculture kids in Capitol Hill coffee shops on stormy winter nights. The sudden, earth-shattering shift came not from a slow accumulation of forensic technological breakthroughs or a deathbed confession, but from a single, crackling telephone call that pierced the quiet routine of the Seattle Cold Case Unit on a cold Tuesday afternoon in April 2026. The digital intake line recorded an incoming call from an untraceable burner phone, the signal bouncing wildly off cell towers in the deep woods of the Olympic Peninsula before connecting to the desk of Detective Sarah Lindquist, the officer currently tasked with maintaining the department's ancient mysteries. The voice on the other end was a low, raspy whisper, trembling with a mixture of terror and acute physical frailty, a voice that didn't introduce itself, but immediately commanded absolute authority by uttering a phrase that had never been released to the public. "The faces from Harrison Street aren't gone," the anonymous caller hissed, the sound of ragged breathing heavy against the receiver. "They're locked in the cedar chest beneath the floorboards of the old bait shop on Eagle Wharf. He kept them all. He watches them when the rain starts." Before Lindquist could engage the caller or initiate a digital trace, the line went completely dead, leaving behind nothing but the hollow hum of static and a sudden, electric tension that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She sat paralyzed for a moment, her mind racing as she realized that the caller had used the specific, classified internal designation for the 1993 crime scene, a detail known only to the killer, the original investigators, and the phantom who had spent 33 years guarding the secret. Within 2 hours, an emergency task force consisting of Seattle homicide detectives, state police units, and forensic specialists was assembled, their unmarked vehicles tearing through the gray afternoon light toward the crumbling, abandoned industrial docks of Eagle Wharf on the southern edge of Elliott Bay. The site was a desolate graveyard of rusted shipping containers and decaying wooden structures, completely isolated from the modern, tech-driven skyline of the city, a place where the past went to rot in silence. They kicked through the waterlogged door of the derelict bait shop, the air inside thick with the stench of salt water, mold, and ancient wood decay, their high-powered flashlights cutting through the darkness like tactical knives. Guided by the anonymous tip, technicians used crowbars to rip up the water-damaged cedar planks near the back of the structure, revealing a hidden, reinforced concrete subfloor containing a vintage, military-grade ammunition container wrapped in heavy plastic seals. When the forensic team carefully sliced through the plastic and pried open the rusted iron latches, a collective intake of breath echoed through the damp room. Resting inside, perfectly preserved against the moisture of the Pacific Northwest, were dozens of black and white photographic prints, their edges jaggedly cut with a razor blade, showing the terrified, candid faces of young women from Seattle's past, with the unmistakable, vibrant face of Claire Montgomery resting right on top. The discovery shifted the cold case into a live, high-speed manhunt, transforming the anonymous tip into a devastating weapon of immediate execution. Tucked beneath the stolen photographs inside the ammunition box was a vintage 1992 Washington State driver's license belonging to a man named Thomas Edward Miller, a 58-year-old reclusive marine mechanic who had resided on a vintage wooden trawler moored at a private slip less than 50 yards from the abandoned bait shop. Miller was a ghost in the modern digital grid. He possessed no social media footprint, used no credit cards, and maintained an unassailable profile as a quiet, eccentric harbor worker who spent his days repairing diesel engines and staring out at the gray waters of the Sound. The surveillance team moved in with absolute tactical silence, utilizing long-range lenses and undercover harbor patrol boats to monitor the target as he prepared his vessel for what appeared to be an immediate departure into the deep, international waters of the Pacific. The tension hung over the water like a physical pressure, the detectives knowing that if Miller managed to slip his moorings into the foggy twilight of Puget Sound, he would vanish into the thousands of miles of rugged Canadian coastline, taking the final truth of the clipped-frame homicide with him forever. The takedown was executed with the terrifying speed and violence of a military raid, designed to deny the suspect any opportunity to destroy evidence or take his own life. At 5:30 a.m., under the cover of a dense maritime fog, a maritime SWAT team swarmed the wooden trawler from 3 separate vectors, their flashbangs detonating with deafening roars that shattered the silence of the marina and lit up the dark water like artificial lightning. Miller was pinned to the deck of his vessel before he could even reach for the loaded hunting rifle mounted beside his captain's chair, his face pressed hard into the wet wood as the steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a sharp, historic finality. As he was led down the floating dock in his oil-stained overalls, his long, gray hair matted against his forehead, he didn't scream or protest his innocence. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Detective Lindquist, his lips parting into a slow, jagged smile that revealed a row of yellowed teeth, his eyes projecting a terrifyingly calm, completely unhinged satisfaction. The news of the arrest hit the city like a thunderbolt, the digital headlines screaming across every screen from Beacon Hill to Ballard. Seattle 1993 cold case solved. Anonymous tip leads to immediate arrest. The collective sigh of relief from a generation of Capitol Hill artists was instantly strangled by a sudden, creeping horror as the city realized that the monster who had turned their community into a hunting ground had been living, working, and watching them from the docks for 33 years. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of the police headquarters interrogation room, the physical presence of Thomas Edward Miller seemed to radiate a cold, damp malevolence that froze the air between the investigators. He sat with his hands shackled to the steel table, refusing to speak to the court-appointed defense attorneys or the frantic prosecutors, his eyes entirely fixed on the black-and-white crime scene photos of Claire Montgomery's apartment that Lindquist had deliberately laid out before him. When Lindquist pushed the container of stolen prints, recovered from his own hidden box, across the table, Miller's composure finally fractured, not with fear, but with a sudden, ecstatic need to claim his legacy. He leaned forward, his voice a low, gravelly rattle that sounded like stones tumbling in the surf, and began to detail the precise choreography of the 1993 murder with a level of clinical, photographic accuracy that left no doubt about his guilt. He recounted how he had followed Claire for 3 months, cataloging her routines, learning the exact rhythm of her darkroom sessions, and watching her through the lens of his own binoculars until he knew her movements better than she knew them herself. He explained that he didn't want her money or her body. He wanted her sight, her unique ability to capture the hidden essence of a person, an essence he believed he could possess permanently by cutting her faces out of the world and locking them away in his dark, subterranean vault. The investigation rapidly expanded into a multi-jurisdictional nightmare as forensic analysts began cross-referencing the other photographs found in Miller's ammunition chest with national databases of missing persons and cold case homicides across the entire West Coast. The results were catastrophic, revealing that the clipped frame homicide was not an isolated act of madness, but the localized manifestation of a multi-decade coastal campaign of terror that stretched from San Diego to the rugged inlets of Alaska. Miller had used his profession as a transient marine mechanic to move seamlessly from harbor to harbor, utilizing the anonymity of waterfront industrial zones to stalk independent young women who frequented seaside art communities and alternative neighborhoods. Each stolen photograph in his chest represented a separate, hidden tragedy, a life systematically erased and reduced to a jaggedly cut trophy preserved in cedar and rust, transforming Thomas Edward Miller into one of the most prolific, undetected serial predators in the history of the Pacific Northwest. The legal proceedings that followed were a mere formality, a clinical processing of a monster who had already written his own damnation in the grain of his victim's stolen work, resulting in a swift conviction and a sentence of multiple consecutive life terms without the remote possibility of parole. Yet, as the prison doors of the Washington State Penitentiary slammed shut behind Miller, sealing him into a concrete tomb for the remainder of his natural life, the dark, damp echo of his crimes refused to release its grip on the soul of Seattle. The resolution of the cold case brought no true catharsis, no peaceful closure to the historic streets of Capitol Hill. Instead, it left behind a jagged, permanent scar of profound institutional distrust and collective vulnerability. The historic brick brownstone on East Harrison Street stood as a silent, haunted monument to a generation's stolen innocence, its windows reflecting the gray, perpetual rains of a city that had spent 33 years applauding a phantom, trusting the very water that washed away his sins. In the quiet corners of the remaining underground galleries and vintage darkrooms, young artists still look over their shoulders whenever the fire escapes creak in the winter wind, their minds permanently infected by the knowledge that the ultimate darkness does not always hide in the shadows of the woods. Sometimes, it lives on the docks, works on the engines, and waits patiently for the rain to start before cutting the faces out of the world. The systematic dismantling of Thomas Edward Miller's double existence began within the claustrophobic confines of the Seattle Police Department's Evidence Control Section, where the air was thick with the scent of ozone, old paper, and chemical preservatives. For 33 years, the original files of the clipped frame homicide had remained frozen in an analog stasis, a collection of typed carbon copies, handwritten detective notebooks, and Polaroid snapshots that failed to capture the true, terrifying dimensions of the predator who had walked through the rain on East Harrison Street. Now, under the harsh, white glare of 2026 LED lighting, a specialized team of digital forensics experts, genetic genealogists, and federal behavioral analysts were reversing the decay of time, transforming a stagnant cold case into an active, multi-jurisdictional war room. Detective Sarah Lindquist stood before a massive electronic grid that covered the entire northern wall of the precinct, her fingers tracing the digital timelines that connected Miller's maritime employment records with a map of unsolved disappearances that read like a dark artery running up and down the Pacific coast. The immediate priority was to verify the integrity of the anonymous tip that had triggered the catastrophic collapse of Miller's empire of silence. The digital audio file of the short, frantic call was run through advanced acoustic analysis software at the FBI's regional field office in Seattle. Technicians worked to isolate the vocal frequencies, filtering out the heavy background rustle of wind and rain that had threatened to drown out the caller's raspy whisper. The results were startling. The acoustic signatures revealed that the call had not been made from an open-air location in the Olympic Peninsula as the initial tower routing suggested, but from within a small, echo-prone space with metallic walls, consistent with the interior of a marine vessel or a shipping container. Furthermore, the vocal stress patterns indicated a person suffering from advanced stage 4 respiratory illness, their breath catching on fluid-filled lungs as they uttered the classified internal jargon of the 1993 investigation. The anonymous phantom who had delivered Miller to the state wasn't a random citizen or a guilty bystander. It was someone who had lived inside his inner circle, someone who had looked into the cedar chest and realized that their own survival was tied to the exposure of the horror within. As the technical teams dissected the audio, a team of tactical detectives descended back upon the Elliott Bay waterfront, executing a secondary, highly invasive search warrant on the Grizzly, the vintage 42-foot wooden trawler that Miller had called home since the late 1990s. The vessel was a masterclass in claustrophobic utility, its interior smelling heavily of diesel fuel, wet dog, and industrial grease. Every surface was immaculately organized, with wrenches, gaskets, and marine parts arranged by size and function with a discipline that bordered on pathological obsession. Inside the small captain's quarters, behind a false bulkhead located beneath the steering station, search teams discovered Miller's true library, a collection of vintage, analog journals dating back to 1978, their pages covered in a tight, microscopic script that detailed the mechanical specifications of every engine he had repaired, interspersed with cold, analytical evaluations of the young women he had observed in the various ports of call. The journals did not contain emotional outbursts or explicit confessions of violence. Instead, they were written in the detached, clinical language of a hunter cataloging game. Miller recorded the weather conditions, the exact phase of the moon, the focal length of the lenses he used to photograph his targets from the water, and the specific psychological vulnerabilities he observed in his victims. One entry, dated October 4, 1993, just 8 days before Claire Montgomery's death, read with a chilling simplicity that made the reading detective's blood run cold. Target C, M, projects high internal focus through her camera. She looks at the world but fails to look at the periphery. Her darkroom on Harrison has a direct sight line from the alley fire escape. The wood is old. The latch is simple. She creates images of faces because she is terrified of her own isolation. I will take the faces. I will leave her with the frame. The level of premeditation documented in these journals completely shattered any potential defense strategy of temporary insanity or spontaneous violence, revealing a mind that treated the systematic stalking of human beings as a highly refined, intellectual pursuit. While forensic teams cataloged the journals, the department's financial analysts began tracking Miller's historical economic footprint, digging into bank accounts that had long been abandoned or closed under various aliases. In the early 1990s, Miller had operated a small, mobile marine repair business called Puget Sound Mechanical, a venture that allowed him to travel between the small marinas, yacht clubs, and commercial fishing docks of western Washington without attracting the attention of local law enforcement. He had paid his taxes in cash, maintained no commercial storefront, and used a series of post office boxes in Tacoma, Everett, and Bellingham to receive parts and payments. This absolute lack of a traditional paper trail had made him entirely invisible to the original 1993 investigators, who had focused their dragnet on Claire's immediate social circle of artists, musicians, and university students, never imagining that the killer was an outsider who viewed their entire bohemian subculture through the binoculars of an industrial laborer. The investigation took a dramatic turn when the state's forensic laboratory completed its initial analysis of the vintage Nikon FM2 camera that had been recovered from Claire's kitchen counter in 1993. Although the original forensic teams had wiped the exterior for latent fingerprints and found nothing, modern forensic technicians utilized a highly specialized process known as vacuum metal deposition, which applies a microscopic layer of gold and zinc to surfaces to reveal prints that are invisible to standard dusting powders. On the internal mechanism of the camera's film advance lever, a part that could only be accessed by opening the back plate to rip out the film roll, the technician discovered a single, perfectly preserved partial latent print. The print was run through the Western Identification Network database, and within 40 seconds, The system delivered a flawless, definitive match. The friction ridges belonged to the right index finger of Thomas Edward Miller, a print that had been logged into the federal system in 1976 following his brief, honorable discharge from the United States Navy as a hull technician. The physical evidence was now absolute, an unshakable link that tied Miller not just to the outer perimeter of the crime scene, but to the specific, destructive act that had blinded the investigation 33 years prior. He had held her camera, opened the chamber, and exposed her final work to the light, his finger leaving behind the permanent calling card of his guilt on the cold steel of the mechanism. Lindquist carried the laboratory report into the secure media briefing room, where the chief of police was preparing to address an international press corps that had transformed the front steps of the precinct into a forest of satellite dishes and glaring studio lights. The public demand for information was insatiable, driven by the terrifying revelation that the clipped frame homicide was merely the tip of a massive, coastal iceberg of violence that threatened to redefine the criminal history of the entire West Coast. Outside the precinct, the city of Seattle was adjusting to a new reality of historical paranoia. In the Capitol Hill neighborhood, where the old brick apartments on Harrison Street had become prime real estate for wealthy tech executives, the residents looked at the aging waterfront workers and marine contractors who still frequented the lower docks with a newfound, defensive suspicion. The illusion that the tech-driven, modern metropolis had washed away the dark, rain-soaked sins of its past was entirely gone, replaced by the realization that the phantoms of the 1990s had never left. They had simply grown old, blended into the background noise of the industrial shipyards, and watched the city transform from the decks of their rusting boats. The local art community organized a retrospective exhibition of Claire Montgomery's surviving work, her stark, black-and-white portraits of street youth hanging in a gallery just blocks from where she died, her empty frames serving as a silent, powerful indictment of a city that had failed to protect her. Back in the interrogation room, the physical deterioration of Thomas Edward Miller was becoming more pronounced with each passing hour of confinement. Without access to the open air of the sound and the constant physical labor of his marine business, he looked smaller, his shoulders stooping under the weight of his orange jail jumpsuit, his breathing rattling heavily within his chest, a symptom that investigators realized matched the respiratory distress of the anonymous caller. Lindquist sat across from him, her posture rigid, her laptop open as she displayed a series of cold case files from Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, British Columbia, dating between 1988 and 1995. "Thomas," Lindquist said, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that cut through the hum of the room's recording equipment. "The finger on the film lever belongs to you. The journals in your bulkhead belong to you. The chest under the floorboards at Eagle Wharf belongs to you. The game is over. What we need to know now is how many other frames you left empty between San Diego and Ketchikan." Miller did not pull his eyes away from the photographs of Claire's apartment. A faint, wheezing chuckle escaped his throat, a sound that transformed into a dry, hacking cough that shook his entire frame before he managed to clear his airway. "You think you've mapped it out, don't you, detective?" he whispered, his voice vibrating with a chilling, arrogant satisfaction. "You look at your digital maps, your timelines, your DNA databases, and you think you've caught a man. But you haven't caught the essence of what happened. I didn't destroy those women. I preserved them. In 1993, Seattle was full of people who wanted to be seen, people who threw their faces into the music, into the art, into the chemicals, burning themselves out like cheap magnesium flares. Claire was capturing their decay, but she didn't know how to stop it. I stopped it. I took their faces at the exact moment their light was perfect, and I kept them safe from the corruption of the years. Look at her picture, detective. She hasn't aged a single day in 33 years. She's still 22. She's still beautiful. She's still mine. I didn't take her life. I made her immortal." The raw, unadulterated sociopathy of the response left an icy stillness in the room, a moment of profound psychological horror that validated every profile the FBI had compiled regarding the clipped frame killer. Miller did not see himself as a murderer or a thief of human potential. He viewed himself as an artist of the absolute highest order, a curator of a secret, tragic gallery of human souls whose survival depended entirely on his willingness to execute them at their peak. The defense team, realizing that their client's explicit admissions were being recorded on high-definition video, tried desperately to interrupt the interview, demanding an immediate psychological evaluation and a suspension of all questioning based on his failing health. But Miller waved them off with a gesture of absolute, aristocratic contempt, his eyes remaining locked on Lindquist as if she were the only other intelligent being in the room, a fellow observer of the dark mechanics of human existence. As the second week of his detention drew to a close, the grand jury returned a comprehensive, multi-count indictment for first-degree aggravated murder, kidnapping, and the destruction of evidence, setting the stage for what promised to be one of the most explosive and scientifically complex legal confrontations in the history of King County. The prosecution began preparing a narrative that would weave the analog realities of the 1990s with the cutting-edge forensic science of 2026, determined to ensure that Thomas Edward Miller would never again see the gray waters of Puget Sound or feel the cold spray of the Pacific wind against his face. The ghost of Claire Montgomery, which had wandered through the rainy alleys of Capitol Hill for more than 3 decades, was finally pulling the net tight around her killer, her stolen work serving as the ultimate, unyielding anchor that would drag him down into the dark corners of the penal system, leaving the city to ponder the terrifying depth of the secrets that still lay buried beneath the wooden planks of its historic waterfront. The formal presentation of the multi-count indictment against Thomas Edward Miller marked the end of the investigative phase and the beginning of a brutal, cold-blooded legal siege inside the King County Courthouse. The historic building, a towering structure of gray stone and reinforced concrete, became the focal point of an international media storm that threatened to paralyze the daily routines of downtown Seattle. Outside on 3rd Avenue, the air was thick with the exhaust fumes of television production trucks, their thick power cables crawling across the wet sidewalks like a nest of black snakes. Inside the prosecutor's high-security briefing room, District Attorney Evelyn Cross stood before an immense whiteboard that had completely replaced the standard office art. The board was an intricate, terrifying web of red strings, digital map printouts, and black-and-white photographs, linking the timeline of Miller's mobile marine repair business with 41 separate, unsolved disappearances across 5 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Cross knew that a grand jury indictment was merely a tactical license to wage war, not a guarantee of a final, sweeping victory before a skeptical modern jury. The defense team, heavily financed by an anonymous civil liberties coalition concerned with the privacy implications of the 2026 forensic breakthrough, had already mobilized a team of top-tier criminal defense attorneys led by Marcus Thorne, a legendary legal tactician known for his ability to dismantle complex forensic cases on narrow constitutional grounds. Thorne's strategy was clear from the first pretrial motions. He would not attempt to argue that Miller was a saint or an ordinary harbor worker. Instead, he would mount a savage, scorched-earth campaign against the integrity of the chain of custody regarding the evidence boxes recovered from the Eagle Wharf bait shop, while simultaneously launching a constitutional challenge against the admissibility of the partial latent print extracted via vacuum metal deposition. The legal battle over the ammunition container became an immediate obsession for the local legal community. Thorne filed a comprehensive motion to suppress all items recovered from the concrete subfloor of the derelict bait shop, arguing that the anonymous phone call that triggered the search did not meet the legal threshold of reliability required to establish probable cause for a warrantless tactical entry. He argued that because the state could not verify the identity, the motives, or the exact location of the raspy-voiced tipster, the entire recovery operation was a violation of the Fourth Amendment, a desperate fishing expedition by an embarrassed police department trying to solve an ancient mystery at the expense of constitutional protections. The phrase, "fruit of the poisonous tree," was repeated across every legal podcast and network news analysis special, casting a sudden, chilling shadow of doubt over what had initially appeared to be an open-and-shut triumph for modern forensic science. To counter Thorne's aggressive constitutional maneuvering, Detective Sarah Lindquist and her team spent days locked inside the city's Central Communications Archive, working with digital audio engineers to extract any hidden data that could validate the emergency nature of the anonymous tip. They discovered a critical detail buried within the background frequencies of the recording that had been overlooked during the initial panic of the arrest. Beneath the low, whistling rattle of the caller's fluid-filled lungs and the distant roar of the coastal wind, the microphone had captured the distinctive, rhythmic clanking of a maritime bell striking a specific pattern, 4 double strokes followed by a single stroke, 9 bells, the traditional nautical signal indicating the change of a watch on a commercial fishing vessel or an industrial harbor station. Lindquist tracked this acoustic fingerprint to a vintage fish processing barge moored at an active commercial dock less than 300 yards from where Miller's trawler had been seized. The barge, known as the Nordic Star, had been out of service for months, serving as a temporary shelter for a rotating cast of transient waterfront workers and aging sailors who lived outside the modern digital grid. When detectives boarded the rusted steel structure, they found the interior completely abandoned, but on a wooden table inside the small galley, sitting beside an empty bottle of industrial-grade painkillers, lay a worn, salt-stained notebook containing a duplicate set of Thomas Edward Miller's marine repair logs from the early 1990s. The handwriting in the notebook didn't belong to Miller. It belonged to a man named Arthur Salty Vance, a retired deckhand who had worked as Miller's occasional assistant during the winter of 1993, a man who had been diagnosed with terminal emphysema just 3 weeks before the anonymous call was made to the precinct. The discovery of Vance's notebooks provided the prosecution with the unshakable foundation they needed to survive Thorne's constitutional challenge. Arthur Vance had not been a random tipster or an illegal wiretapper. He had been an eyewitness to the immediate aftermath of Claire Montgomery's execution, a man who had spent 33 years carrying the crushing weight of his partner's dark secrets out of an acute fear for his own physical survival. The notebook contained a detailed entry from the morning of October 13, 1993, describing how Miller had returned to their shared workshop at Eagle Wharf covered in mud and smelling heavily of industrial darkroom chemicals, carrying a heavy canvas bag that he refused to let anyone touch. Tom's eyes were different today. Vance had written in his ragged, trembling script. The light inside him went out. He spent 3 hours under the floorboards with his ammunition chest. I heard the latches click. I know what he did to that girl on Harrison Street. If I speak, I'm next into the sound. The presentation of Arthur Vance's journals at the preliminary hearing fell upon the courtroom like a physical blow, completely neutralizing the defense's argument that the tip was an unverified, unreliable piece of hearsay. The judge reviewed the material in chambers before issuing a sweeping, definitive ruling that denied the motion to suppress, declaring that the evidence recovered from the cedar chest was entirely admissible under the inevitable discovery doctrine and the verified credibility of an active co-conspirator's contemporaneous notes. The decision was a monumental victory for the state, effectively sealing the physical evidence into the record and forcing Thorne to abandon his technical defense in favor of a much more difficult, psychologically volatile strategy based on the mental capacity of the defendant himself. As the summer of 2026 arrived, turning the gray Seattle skyline into a temporary brilliant blue, the public focus shifted toward the interior of the King County Jail, where Thomas Edward Miller's health was undergoing a rapid, catastrophic collapse. Deprived of the maritime atmosphere and the constant physical activity that had sustained his dual existence for decades, his respiratory system was failing, his lungs filling with fluid as the advanced stages of the same disease that killed his assistant began to claim his body. He spent his days confined to the medical wing of the facility, hooked up to an oxygen concentrator, his thin arms bruised from repeated blood draws and intravenous lines. Yet, despite his physical frailty, his psychological armor remained entirely untouched. He refused to wear the standard inmate hospital gown, demanding instead his oil-stained work shirts, treating the prison nurses and physicians with the same cool, aristocratic condescension he had displayed on the night of his arrest. The state's chief psychiatric evaluator, Dr. Helena Ross, spent over 20 hours inside the secure interview room with Miller, trying to map out the psychological landscape of a predator who had managed to evade the national criminal justice grid for over 3 generations. Her final report, leaked to the press in fragmented, terrifying summaries, described a classic, highly organized serial offender possessed by an extreme form of aesthetic fetishism. The defendant does not possess the standard hallmarks of sadism or chaotic violence, Dr. Ross wrote in her evaluation. He views himself entirely as a collector of moments, an absolute curator who steps into a chaotic, messy world to extract what he perceives as flawless beauty. For Miller, the act of execution is not a manifestation of rage. It is a clinical preservation technique. He views his victims not as human beings with futures, but as raw photographic material that must be fixed in time before the natural decay of age and experience can corrupt their aesthetic value. He feels no remorse because, in his internal reality, he has done these women the ultimate service. He has saved them from the passage of time. This chilling psychological evaluation set the stage for the official commencement of the trial, a proceeding that promised to be a profound confrontation between the analog horrors of the 20th century and the clinical, digital tools of modern detection. The prosecution began finalizing their witness list, which included not only the forensic scientists who had extracted the latent print from Claire's camera lever, but also a long procession of aging witnesses from the early 1990s grunge scene, former bartenders, musicians, and gallery owners who would reconstruct the vibrant, doomed counterculture that Miller had systematically utilized as his private hunting ground. The ghost of Claire Montgomery, which had lingered in the cold rains of Capitol Hill for 33 years, was finally walking into the well of the courtroom, her own stolen images serving as the ultimate, unyielding net that would permanently anchor her killer to the floor of a state penitentiary. The opening statements of the state of Washington versus Thomas Edward Miller commenced on a morning when the gray Puget Sound fog rolled heavy into the downtown corridors, wrapping the King County Courthouse in a cold, damp embrace that felt like an intentional echo of 1993. The courtroom was an arena of absolute tension, every bench packed with journalists from global crime desks, aging icons of the Pacific Northwest music scene, and tech executives who now lived in the brownstones of Capitol Hill. District Attorney Evelyn Cross approached the podium with a slow, deliberate stride that commanded absolute silence. She didn't begin her address by invoking the cutting-edge science of 2026 or the dramatic nature of the waterfront arrest. Instead, she adjusted her microphone and read directly from Claire Montgomery's final journal entry, written just hours before her life was stolen on East Harrison Street. Cross painted a visceral, Dawn Dapp portrait of a young woman on the absolute precipice of greatness, a photographer whose camera was a tool to uncover the hidden soul of a transforming city. Then, the prosecutor's voice dropped to a low, chilling register as she turned her focus to the defense table, pointing a single, rigid finger at the emaciated man sitting beside his high-priced legal team. The defendant did not see an artist when he looked through his binoculars from the alley, Cross declared, her voice vibrating through the courtroom speakers. He saw a target. He saw a collection of features to be systematically hunted, harvested, and locked away in a dark ammunition chest beneath the floorboards of a derelict bait shop. He did not just end Claire Montgomery's life. He tried to erase her sight, ripping the faces from her portfolio as if he could absorb her talent by destroying her work. For 33 years, he believed the Seattle rain had washed away his signature, but today, the science he couldn't anticipate will show you that he left his identity permanently burned into the steel of her camera. When Marcus Thorne stood up for the defense's opening statement, the atmosphere in the room shifted from emotional outrage to cold, analytical skepticism. Thorne was a master of legal deconstruction, his posture relaxed, his voice projecting an effortless, soothing authority designed to lower the psychological stakes for the 12 jurors. He did not attempt to romanticize Thomas Edward Miller or deny the horrific nature of the stolen photographs found at Eagle Wharf. Instead, he sought to frame the entire prosecution as a historical, technology-driven witch hunt orchestrated by an embattled police department desperate to salvage its own institutional failures. He argued that the partial latent print recovered from the interior of Claire's Nikon FM2 was an unreliable artifact, an ancient trace that could have been deposited at any point during the decades the camera sat in an inadequately monitored, analog evidence locker before the digital protocols of 2026 were implemented. They are asking you to convict an elderly, dying man based on microscopic traces and the unverified journals of a deceased addict, Thorne countered, his eyes locking onto the jury box. They want to substitute modern digital graphics for absolute, reasonable doubt. The prosecution's first witness was Detective Sarah Lindquist, who walked to the stand carrying a heavy, clear plastic container containing the vintage ammunition chest recovered from beneath the floorboards of Eagle Wharf. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the massive high-definition display screens behind the witness box came alive with the forensic recovery videos filmed on the afternoon of the anonymous tip. The gallery watched in absolute, breathless horror as the digital camera tracked the crowbars ripping through the waterlogged cedar planks, revealing the hidden concrete vault and the rusted iron latches of the container. Lindquist described the preservation techniques used by the forensic team, explaining how the airtight seals of the military-grade chest had inadvertently protected the stolen photographs from the destructive moisture of the Puget Sound climate, keeping the biological and physical evidence in a state of near-flawless stasis for over 3 decades. Cross stepped forward, requesting permission to display the contents of the container to the jury. As the high-resolution images of the jaggedly cut black-and-white prints appeared on the monitors, a collective wave of gasps and muffled sobs swept through the front rows of the gallery. The faces of young women from Seattle's past, some smiling, some staring into the lens with a raw, avant-garde intensity, were displayed with their edges crudely sliced by a razor blade. Right on top of the stack was the vibrant, unmistakable face of Claire Montgomery, her eyes possessing a haunting, luminous quality that seemed to look directly at the 12 citizens who held her killer's fate in their hands. Lindquist testified that every single print had been analyzed under a spectral comparator, proving that the paper stock, the chemical development signatures, and the physical fiber structures matched the exact materials found in Claire's Harrison Street darkroom in October 1993. The tactical momentum of the trial intensified during the second week when the prosecution called its chief forensic technician, Dr. Alan Vance, to explain the vacuum metal deposition process that had extracted Miller's latent print from the interior of the camera's film advance lever. Vance utilized an interactive 3D digital model of the Nikon FM2 to guide the jury through the internal mechanics of the device, showing how a person would have to hold the frame and apply specific downward pressure to the internal release mechanism to rip a film canister out of its housing without opening the main latch. The rich characteristics of this print are not an accidental smudge or a secondary transfer. Dr. Vance testified with absolute, scientific finality. The gold-zinc particles adhered exclusively to the ancient sebaceous oil deposits left by a human finger applying more than 5 pounds of localized pressure. The friction ridges matched the right index finger of Thomas Edward Miller with a mathematical certainty of 99.9%. There is no contamination, no storage decay, and no laboratory error that can alter the fact that the defendant's hand was inside that camera when the film was exposed to the light. Thorne's cross-examination of Dr. Vance was a savage, multi-hour assault on the history of the evidence locker. He produced old logs from the mid-1990s showing that the box containing Claire's camera had been moved 3 separate times during department structural renovations, arguing that the seals had been broken and that the camera had been handled by numerous ungloved clerks whose identities were lost to history. But Vance remained completely unshakable, his calm, clinical explanations systematically neutralizing Thorne's technical challenges. He demonstrated that the specific print was located on an internal, recessed steel arm that could only be touched if the entire mechanism was intentionally held open in a way that standard evidence handlers would never attempt, proving that the print was deposited by the individual who deliberately destroyed the film roll in the immediate aftermath of the homicide. The emotional climax of the state's case occurred when the prosecution introduced the audio recordings and the physical journals of Arthur Salty Vance, the deceased waterfront assistant whose deathbed guilt had broken the case wide open. Because Vance had passed away before the trial commenced, his words were introduced through a series of legally clear depositions and verified audio files recorded by Detective Lindquist during the initial hours of the 2026 investigation. The courtroom grew entirely cold as the raspy, fluid-filled voice of the dying old sailor filled the chamber, his breath catching painfully on his failing lungs as he described the true nature of his relationship with the man sitting at the defense table. Tom wasn't like the rest of us on the docks. Salty's voice rattled through the speakers, sounding like a ghost speaking from a deep underground well. We worked on the diesels, we drank at the taverns, we tried to forget the gray weather. But Tom, he lived for the nights when the storm came in heavy. He would stay out on the deck of the Grizzly with his cameras, watching the city through the fog like a hawk watching a field. The night that girl died on Harrison Street, he came back to the bait shop before dawn. He didn't say a word to me, but his hands were shaking so hard he couldn't hold his wrench. I watched him go under the floorboards with that canvas bag. When I looked into his logs later that week, I saw her name written next to a list of numbers, focal lengths, times, coordinates. He didn't kill her out of anger. He killed her because he was collecting her. He kept her face like a butterfly pinned to a piece of cardboard. I wanted to tell the police, but Tom looked at me one afternoon and said, "The sound is deep, salty, and the tide carries everything away eventually." I knew what he meant. I knew if I spoke, I'd be the one the water carried away. Throughout the entire process, Thomas Edward Miller sat in his wheelchair at the defense table, his oxygen tank humming softly beside him, his physical presence a withered shadow of the predator described in the testimonies. Yet his eyes remained terrifyingly alive, two black pools of absolute, unyielding intelligence that darted across the room, analyzing the witnesses, the jurors, and the prosecutors with the detached, curious expression of an apex predator observing a laboratory experiment. He didn't flinch at the graphic crime scene photos, nor did he look away when Salty's voice filled the room. Instead, a faint, near-invisible twitch appeared at the corner of his lips whenever a witness described his precision, a silent, monstrous validation of his own hidden legacy that made the observing behavioral analysts in the front row shiver with a profound, diagnostic certainty. The prosecution was closing the net. The analog secrets of 1993 were being decoded by the digital light of 2026, and the city of Seattle was about to witness the final, explosive confrontation as the defense prepared to make its final move to protect the monster of Eagle Wharf from the absolute weight of historical justice. The transition from the prosecution's devastating presentation of Arthur Salty Vance's deathbed journals to the opening of the defense's active case turned the King County Courthouse into a battlefield of extreme psychological and legal maneuvering. Marcus Thorne knew that the structural foundations of his standard defense had been completely pulverized by the scientific certainty of the gold-zinc latent print and the haunting, raspy audio of the deceased sailor. The courtroom gallery sat in an expectant, breathless hush on the 13th morning of the trial, the air thick with the smell of industrial wet rain that beat relentlessly against the high, narrow windows. Thorne stood at the podium, his face a calculated mask of professional sorrow and medical concern, as he turned his back on the jury box to look directly at the withered, breathing figure of his client. The defense strategy was no longer about establishing an alibi or creating doubt about the Eagle Wharf bait shop. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble centered on the absolute physical and cognitive dissolution of the man who had allegedly engineered the most sophisticated serial campaign in the history of the Pacific Northwest. Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Eris Thornvon, Chief of Neurological Pathology at the University of Washington Medical Center, Thorne announced, his voice projecting a calm, clinical authority designed to steer the jury away from the emotional weight of Claire Montgomery's stolen portraits. A sharp, elegant woman in her mid-50s stepped up to the witness stand, her posture radiating the unassailable prestige of academic medicine. She carried a digital tablet containing a series of high-resolution, three-dimensional brain scans that were instantly projected onto the massive courtroom monitors. The images showed a human brain riddled with dark, hollowed-out gaps and severe cortical atrophy, a landscape of neurological decay that looked like a map of a city destroyed by a slow-motion bombardment. Thorne approached the witness box, his hands slipped casually into his pockets to project an aura of relaxed, unshakable confidence. Dr. Thornvon, please explain to the jury what we are looking at on these monitors and describe your recent diagnostic evaluation of the defendant, Thomas Edward Miller. The pathologist cleared her throat, her voice adopting the detached, objective tone of a scientist reviewing laboratory data. These are advanced functional MRI and PET scans of Mr. Miller's brain, completed within the last 10 days at the jail's secure medical unit, she explained, pointing a digital laser at the prominent dark voids in the frontal and temporal lobes. The diagnostic indicators are absolute and irreversible. Mr. Miller is in the terminal stages of frontotemporal dementia, complicated by severe cerebral hypoxia resulting from his advanced pulmonary emphysema. This specific pathology causes a total structural degeneration of the neural pathways responsible for impulse control, moral reasoning, and the accurate retrieval of historical memory. The witness turned toward the jury, her expression completely devoid of personal bias. To expect a mind in this state of advanced organic decay to provide an accurate, reliable account of events that occurred 33 years ago is a medical impossibility. What the prosecution labels as a chilling, calculated confession during his initial interrogation was not an accurate retrieval of historical truth. It was a classic manifestation of confabulation. In patients suffering from terminal FTD, the brain automatically fabricates highly detailed, narrative structures to fill the massive, terrifying voids left by memory loss. Mr. Miller has spent decades working in the dark, isolated industrial docks, consuming local urban legends about the clipped frame homicide. His decaying mind has absorbed the details of Claire Montgomery's death, internalizing them until he truly believes he was the architect of the crime. He is not a master criminal playing a game. He's a dying, profoundly demented man living inside a neurological hallucination. The explanation was delivered with such flawless, scientific plausibility that a ripple of intense unease passed through the prosecution's table. Marcus Thorne capitalized on the moment immediately, guiding the witness through an exhaustive, multi-hour review of Miller's historical medical charts, demonstrating that his physical and cognitive decline had been documented by Harbor clinics long before his arrest in 2026. He sought to frame the entire waterfront interrogation not as a triumph of justice, but as a predatory exploitation of an old, dying man whose decaying brain was eager to please the aggressive detectives by reciting the dark folklore of the Seattle waterfront. By the time Thorne sat down, he had managed to introduce a powerful, deeply unsettling counter-narrative, an alternative reality where the state was attempting to execute a man not for what he did in 1993, but for the tragic, uncontrollable delusions of his terminal illness. But the atmosphere of clinical skepticism vanished instantly the moment District Attorney Evelyn Cross rose for her cross-examination. She didn't approach the podium. Instead, she walked directly to the evidence table, picking up the heavy canvas bag containing Miller's original, handwritten journals from the Grizzly, the vintage logs written in that tight, microscopic script that spanned 4 decades. She dropped the heavy spools of paper onto the witness rail right in front of Dr. Thorne Vaughan with a loud, definitive thud that echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Dr. Thorne Vaughan, Cross began, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that commanded immediate, absolute attention. You've given us a fascinating lecture on the tragedies of human dementia. So, let us test your medical theories against the continuous, uninterrupted execution of a 33-year obsession written by the defendant's own hand. Cross opened one of the vintage journals to a page dated November 14, 1998, exactly 5 years after Claire Montgomery's death. I am reading from an entry written when the defendant was 43 years old, decades before any neural atrophy occurred. He writes, "The anniversary of Harrison Street passed in total silence. The rain came from the southwest, exactly as it did 5 years ago. I reviewed the prints in the cedar box tonight. The grain of the paper holds her skin perfectly. The police are still searching for Phantom in the grunge clubs. They don't understand that an artist doesn't leave his work in the street. He keeps it in the dark where the years cannot fade the contrast. Tell me, doctor, is it your expert medical opinion that a 43-year-old active marine contractor, operating a successful mobile business with precision, was also suffering from terminal confabulation when he recorded the exact weather patterns and structural metrics of his crimes?" Objection. Thorne shouted, slamming his palm onto the defense table. The prosecutor is mischaracterizing the medical timeline. The journals have not been authenticated as an uninterrupted psychological record. Overruled. The judge snapped, his eyes fixed with an intense, unyielding focus on the witness stand. The witness will answer the question based on her diagnostic expertise. Dr. Thorne Vaughan adjusted her glasses, her professional composure fracturing slightly under Cross's fierce, uncompromising gaze. If the journals are authentic and contemporaneous, the pathologist admitted, her voice losing its previous academic certainty, then they would indicate a highly organized, long-term cognitive fixation that predates his current neurological degeneration. However, his current state remains terminal, and his modern admissions are still heavily compromised by his organic decay. Cross didn't give the witness a single second to recover, driving her questions forward with Dawn Dapp, rapid-fire precision that cut through the defense's medical camouflage like a tactical knife. Let us speak of his modern state then, Doctor. You say his brain cannot accurately retrieve historical truth. Let us look at how his decaying mind operated on the morning of his arrest in April 2026. When the tactical team swarmed the Grizzly, they found that the defendant had already disconnected his vessel's shore power, loaded 300 gallons of diesel fuel using a cash transaction under a false name, and cleared his GPS navigation logs for a direct route into the international waters of the Pacific. He did not behave like a confused, demented old man wandering through a historical hallucination. He behaved like a highly disciplined, terrifyingly self-aware predator who knew the net was pulling tight around his waterfront vault. He didn't flee because he was confused, Doctor. He fled because the anonymous tip had stripped away his invisibility, and his instinct for survival was as sharp and lethal as the razor blade he used to cut the faces out of Claire Montgomery's portfolio. The courtroom was completely breathless, all eyes anchored on the witness box as the defense's medical narrative disintegrated under the weight of the active, operational facts of the arrest. Cross turned away from the witness, her boots making a sharp, rhythmic snapping sound against the hardwood floor as she walked over to the defense table, stopping just inches from Thomas Edward Miller's wheelchair. The doctor sat perfectly still, his thin chest rising and falling with the rhythmic, mechanical hum of his oxygen concentrator, his long, gray hair hanging like a silver curtain around his pale, translucent face. But as Cross stood over him, Miller slowly tilted his chin upward, his lips parting into that slow, jagged, yellow-toothed smile that had terrified the detectives on the night of his arrest. His black eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that was pure, frozen, and completely undemented, a look of such absolute, unvarnished arrogance that it silenced the entire room with a physical weight. He didn't look like a victim of organic decay. He looked like a sovereign ruler who was thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of his own exposure, a monster who believed that his lifetime of hidden slaughter placed him entirely beyond the moral comprehension of the citizens who sat in judgment of his flesh. The psychological warfare inside the courtroom reached a state of frozen, terrifying clarity as Dr. Eris Thorne Vaughan stepped down from the witness stand, her academic authority utterly dismantled by the prosecution's relentless operational timeline. The defense table sat in a state of grim, heavy silence, the high-priced legal team surrounding Thomas Edward Miller looking less like defenders of an innocent man and more like a cleanup crew at a catastrophic train wreck. Marcus Thorne stood at the podium, his posture noticeably stiffened, his fingers tapping a nervous, erratic rhythm against the wood of the lectern. He knew his medical defense had been completely hollowed out by Cross's fierce cross-examination. The illusion of a confused, demented old man had been stripped away, leaving behind the dark, unyielding reality of a highly organized, lethal predator who had outsmarted the state for 33 years. With his back firmly against the legal wall, Thorne made the ultimate, most dangerous move available in the modern American justice system. He decided to let the monster speak for himself. "Your Honor," Thorne announced, his voice dropping into a low, solemn register that made the packed gallery lean forward in unison. The defense calls Thomas Edward Miller to the stand. A collective intake of breath rattled through the courtroom like a sudden winter wind. Court officers instantly shifted into high-alert formations, 3 heavily armed deputies stepping into the well of the court to escort the wheelchair-bound defendant toward the witness box. The mechanical hum of his oxygen concentrator seemed to amplify in the silence, a rhythmic, wheezing pulse that sounded like the respirations of the historic building itself. As the deputies locked the wheels of his chair beside the witness rail, Miller slowly lifted his hands, his wrinkled, oil-stained fingers clasping together over his lap with a chilling, serene composure. He did not look at his defense attorney, nor did he look at the judge. Instead, his black, piercing eyes locked onto the jury box, sweeping across the faces of the 12 citizens of Seattle with the clinical, calculating intensity of an engineer inspecting a piece of machinery. Thorne approached the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps, attempting to establish a calm, non-threatening cadence that would allow his client to project an aura of vulnerable, historical exhaustion. "Mr. Miller," Thorne began, his voice soft, almost paternal, "you have sat through 3 weeks of graphic, devastating testimony. You have heard yourself described as a ghost, a phantom, and a prolific serial predator. I want to ask you, under oath, to look at this jury today and tell them the truth about what happened on the night of October 12, 1993, inside the apartment on East Harrison Street." Miller tilted his head slightly, his long, silver hair shifting away from his face to reveal the sharp, angular lines of his jaw. When he spoke, his voice was not the weak, fragmented whisper the defense had led the court to expect. It was a low, resonant, gravelly rattle, a sound that carried the deep, industrial echo of the Elliott Bay shipyards, cutting through the room's microphone system with a terrifyingly clear authority. "The truth," Miller whispered, a faint, condescending smile playing at the corners of his lips, "is that the prosecution is trying to judge a masterpiece using the language of a traffic violation. They sit there with their digital maps, their timelines, and their zinc gold dust, trying to reconstruct a moment they could never understand. I was on Harrison Street that night. I walked through the rain, and I climbed that fire escape. But I didn't go there to destroy Claire Montgomery. I went there to save her from the absolute mediocrity of her own future." A wave of low, horrified murmurs swept through the gallery, but the judge didn't strike his gavel. He sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the defendant with an intense, analytical revulsion. Thorne tried desperately to redirect his client, his face rapidly draining of color as he realized that Miller was completely abandoning the narrative of neurological delusion. "Mr. Miller, please clarify what you mean by that. Are you stating that you did not commit an act of violence against Miss Montgomery?" Miller let out a short, wheezing chuckle that transformed into a dry, hollow cough before he cleared his throat, his black eyes flashing with a sudden, aristocratic fury. "Violence is the tool of the uneducated, Marcus. What I performed was an act of absolute curation," Miller declared, his voice rising, vibrating with an unhinged, creative conviction that froze the blood of every juror in the box. Seattle in 1993 was a city full of children who thought they were immortal because they knew how to play a guitar or take a black-and-white photograph. They were burning themselves out in the dark, consuming themselves with chemicals, throwing their youth into a void that would have forgotten them in a decade. Claire was capturing their decay through her lens, but she didn't know how to stop it. She was going to grow old. She was going to lose her sight. She was going to take corporate headshots to pay her rent in Bellevue. I stepped into her frame to freeze the contrast permanently. I took her faces out of the world because they were perfect at that exact second, and I locked them in cedar and steel where the passage of the years could never rot their beauty. Look at her portrait on that screen. She is still 22. She is still beautiful. She belongs to the rain and the silver halide forever because I had the courage to cut her out of the timeline. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic storm of emotion. In the front row, Claire's younger brother stood up, his face contorted with a blind, devastating rage, his voice cracking as he screamed curses at the smiling monster in the wheelchair before being immediately restrained by 3 court deputies and escorted out into the corridor. The families of the other missing women clung to one another, their faces pale with an absolute, unvarnished horror. The man they had spent 33 years hunting wasn't denying his atrocities. He was bragging about them, treating a multi-decade campaign of hidden slaughter as his personal, artistic legacy. Marcus Thorne sank back into his chair at the defense table, his hands covering his face in a gesture of total, sweeping defeat, realizing that any hope of a legal defense had just been permanently vaporized by his own client's monstrous, uncontrollable vanity. District Attorney Evelyn Cross did not wait for the room to settle, rising from the prosecution table like a predatory bird, her boots making a sharp, thunderous snapping sound against the floorboards as she walked into the well of the court. She stood just 2 feet from Miller, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with an unyielding moral clarity that matched the intensity of his malice. She didn't carry a binder of files or a display of charts. She stood before him armed only with the absolute weight of historical justice. "So, Mr. Miller," Cross began, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register that sliced through the residual murmurs of the room like a razor blade. "You call yourself a curator. You call yourself an artist who saves women from the passage of time. Let us look at the clinical, ugly reality of your art. When you climbed that fire escape on East Harrison Street, wearing your industrial gloves and carrying your razor blade, you didn't offer Claire Montgomery an aesthetic choice. You crept up behind her while she was working at her desk, and you used her own camera strap to strangle her. You applied specific downward pressure to her windpipe, watching her fight for her breath, watching her hands claw fruitlessly at the leather until her heart stopped beating. Tell me, curator, did you see the absolute beauty in her terror? Did you evaluate the contrast of her skin as it turned blue under your hands?" Miller's smirk didn't vanish. It widened, his yellowed teeth glistening under the white LED lights of the courtroom, his breathing rattling heavily inside his chest as he leaned forward over the wooden rail of the witness box, his face just inches from the prosecutor's. "I saw the exact moment the light left her eyes, Miss Cross," he whispered, his voice a guttural, venomous rattle that was picked up perfectly by the microphone, echoing through the courtroom speakers like a curse from the past. "It is a transition that no camera can ever capture, the precise microsecond where the flesh becomes an artifact. I didn't hate her. I revered her. And when I opened that camera and ripped the film roll out of its housing, leaving my mark on the lever, I wasn't hiding from your police department. I was blinding you. I was making sure that the final image she saw, the image of her savior, would remain a private exhibition, locked away in the dark where your inferior minds could never analyze the grain. Go ahead and lock up this withered flesh, Miss Cross. Put this old body in your concrete box. It doesn't matter. The frames are already empty, the faces are already mine, and I have lived a life of absolute, untouchable perfection while you were still learning how to read your law books." The confession hung in the air like a lethal gas, an admission of such pure, unadulterated sociopathy that it struck the jury box like a physical blow. Cross did not offer a dramatic retort or a triumphant display of emotion. She stood perfectly still in the center of the well, letting the horrific echo of Miller's words sink deep into the minds of the 12 citizens who held his fate in their hands. She simply turned her back on the smiling monster in the wheelchair, walking back to the prosecution table with a slow, deliberate pace that signaled the definitive, final conclusion of the state's interrogation. The Phantom of Eagle Wharf had finally been stripped of his camouflage, exposed to the light of day not by a failure of his intellect, but by the ultimate, self-destructive weight of his own calculated arrogance. The trial was effectively over. The truth had been written in the record in letters of blood and fire, and the city of Seattle was about to witness the final, sweeping stroke of justice for a ghost that had waited 33 years in the rain. The thunderous echo of Thomas Edward Miller's horrific courtroom confession hung over the chamber like toxic smog, paralyzing the legal machinery of the King County Courthouse for several agonizing seconds. The 12 jurors sat completely motionless, their expressions locked in a collective state of profound, bone-chilling shock. Some stared at their hands, unable to process the unvarnished malice that had just vibrated through the courtroom speakers, while others kept their eyes pinned to the floor, actively avoiding the piercing, celebratory gaze of the emaciated monster in the wheelchair. Marcus Thorne remained slumped at the defense table, his legal pad pushed aside, his fingers dug deep into his temples. He didn't look at his co-counsel, he didn't look at the bench. He knew with absolute, professional finality that his career as an elite criminal defender had just hit an iron wall built by the uncontrollable, monstrous vanity of his own client. The judge was the first to reclaim the room, his gavel striking the wooden block 3 times with an immense, cannon-like report that shattered the silence and made the front rows of the gallery jump. "The witness will step down," the judge ordered, his voice vibrating with an intense, unvarnished disgust that he didn't even attempt to mask. "Mr. Thorne, does the defense have any further witnesses to present to this court?" Thorne stood up with a heavy, dragging motion, his shoulders hunched as if he were suddenly carrying the weight of all 41 cold cases currently tied to Miller's maritime logs. He kept his eyes averted from the defendant, whose breathing tank hummed along with a serene, terrifying rhythm. "No, Your Honor," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking slightly under the historical strain. "The defense rests." The court was immediately adjourned for a 24-hour recess to allow both sides to finalize their closing arguments, and the moment the massive mahogany exit doors swung open, the media plaza outside erupted into absolute, unbridled chaos. The news of Miller's explicit, artistic justification of the clipped-frame homicide swept through the Pacific Northwest like a digital wildfire, saturating live streams, interrupting national broadcasts, and drawing thousands of citizens to the rain-slicked steps of the courthouse on 3rd Avenue. The historical mystery that had haunted the Capitol Hill neighborhood for 33 years was no longer an abstract cold case or a debate over forensic protocols. It was a live-streamed excavation of a serial predator's soul. Under the flashing neon signs of downtown Seattle, spontaneous crowds gathered, holding printouts of Claire Montgomery's stark, black-and-white photography, their faces illuminated by the blue glare of smartphones broadcasting the graphic details of the doctor of Engine's self-destruction. Inside the prosecution's high-security war room, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of celebration, remaining heavy with a somber, focused intensity. District Attorney Evelyn Cross sat at the head of a conference table buried beneath towering columns of archival evidence containers. She knew that while Miller's witness stand outburst was a fatal blow to his legal survival, her closing argument needed to be a definitive, flawless summation that would leave the jury with absolutely no avenue for cognitive escape. She needed to weave together the scientific absolute of the 2026 vacuum metal deposition print, the historical geography of the 1993 alleys, and the chilling psychological architecture that the defendant had so arrogance-fueled validated. She worked through the night, the steady patter of the midnight Seattle rain beating against her office window, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she crafted a narrative designed to serve as the final, sweeping stroke of historical justice for Claire Montgomery and every other woman whose face had been excised into the dark. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was a pressure cooker of historic anticipation. The gallery was packed so tightly that court marshals were forced to establish a rigid human wall along the central aisle, preventing the emotional overflow from spilling into the well of the court. The families of the missing women from Oregon, California, and Alaska sat in the front 3 rows, their hands interlocked in a tight, protective chain of shared survival and impending vindication. When Miller was wheeled into the room by 3 heavily armed deputies, a cold, suffocating silence greeted him, a collective, societal shunning that stripped him of the theatrical attention his narcissism so desperately craved. He sat down at the defense table, his expression once again smooth, clean, and detached, as if he had spent his hours in the medical wing convincing himself that his monstrous admission was an act of supreme intellectual dominance rather than a catastrophic legal suicide. Evelyn Cross rose from her chair, adjusted the lapel of her dark wool blazer, and walked toward the jury box for her final address to the 12 citizens of King County. She carried no notes, no digital tablets, and no physical exhibits. She stood before the box, her posture rigid, her voice carrying a resonant, unyielding moral clarity that commanded absolute focus from the very first syllable. "Gentlemen and ladies of the jury," Cross began, her words deliberate, pacing the length of the rail. 33 years ago, on a night exactly like this one, a brilliant young woman named Claire Montgomery sat in a studio on East Harrison Street. She believed in the unique power of sight. She believed that by capturing the raw, candid faces of this city's counterculture, she could save something genuine from being forgotten by history. She trusted the community she lived in. She locked her door against the known dangers of the world, never imagining that the phantom who would steal her life was watching her from the dark of the alley fire escape, a man who didn't see an artist, but an object to be harvested. She stopped, making direct, intense eye contact with each juror in sequence. For more than 3 decades, Thomas Edward Miller lived a life of absolute, untouchable impunity. He repaired marine diesels, he navigated the waters of the Sound, and he blended seamlessly into the industrial fabric of our waterfront. He thought he had executed the perfect crime. He thought that by destroying the film roll, by slicing the faces out of her portfolio, and by using his specialized knowledge to kill without leaving an obvious struggle response, he had permanently blinded the eyes of justice. He believed that the passage of the years was his ultimate shield, that every winter rain that washed over Seattle washed away a layer of his identity until his sins were nothing more than a neighborhood urban legend. But he made one fatal calculation. He forgot that the truth is not an abstract shadow, it is a physical, indelible signature written into the very steel of the world. Cross turned her entire body, pointing a dramatic, rigid hand directly at the withered figure in the wheelchair, her voice rising into a powerful, dawn-dap crescendo that shook the high ceilings of the historic room. Science caught up with him. The relentless march of human progress, the very progress he mocked from the witness stand, became his executioner. In 2026, the gold-zinc particles of modern forensics read the ancient oils he left behind on the interior lever of Claire's camera, a signature as unique and undeniable as a star in an empty sky. And if that scientific absolute were not enough, you heard the final truth from his own mouth. You saw the mask slide away. You saw the raw, unhinged arrogance of a monster who justified the strangulation of a 22-year-old girl because he wanted to freeze her contrast permanently. Do not allow his madness to serve as his protection. Validate the science that trapped him, honor the voice of Salty Vance that exposed his vault, and let the ghost of Claire Montgomery finally walk out of the rainy dark and into the permanent light of justice. When Cross returned to the prosecution table, a collective, heavy sigh swept through the entire gallery, a profound release of 33 years of pent-up sorrow that left several of the victims' mothers openly weeping into their hands. Marcus Thorne then approached the podium for his closing remarks, his head slightly lowered, his voice completely stripped of the theatrical fire that had defined his long career as a defender of high-profile clients. He knew he was playing a permanently broken hand, trying to salvage a defense that his own client had gleefully set on fire. He didn't attempt to recontextualize Miller's horrific descriptions of curation or justify his chilling words. Instead, he launched into a highly technical, dry plea centered entirely on the concepts of legal insanity, cognitive dissolution, and the strict boundaries of reasonable doubt regarding ancient storage logs. It was a highly competent, professional performance, but it rang entirely hollow in a room that was still vibrating with the echo of a serial predator's literal self-glorification. The judge delivered his final, clinical instructions to the jury with a cold, precise execution, detailing the legal definitions of aggravated first-degree murder, kidnapping, and the intentional destruction of forensic evidence. At 2:15 p.m., the 12 jurors stood up, filed out of the courtroom in absolute silence, and entered the secure deliberation chamber, the heavy iron bolt clicking into place behind them with a sharp, historic finality. The clock on the mahogany wall began its slow, torturous countdown, marking the beginning of a wait that many veteran court reporters expected to last for days, given the immense volume of multi-state logs and technical metallurgical testing introduced during the trial. Outside on 3rd Avenue, the scene transformed into an absolute digital circus, with news anchors scrambling to their live-shot positions beneath the gray, drizzling sky, speculating on whether the defense team would immediately file an emergency appeal based on the cognitive capacity of the defendant. The local television networks brought on historical panels of legal scholars and forensic geneticists who analyzed every frame of Miller's witness stand monologue, predicting that his unhinged words would become a defining case study in the dark psychology of aesthetic fetishism and the ultimate, self-destructive failure of malignant narcissism. Inside the long, stone corridors of the courthouse, the air remained thick with an electric suspense, a community hanging in total balance as 33 years of unresolved Pacific Northwest trauma waited for a final, sweeping resolution. The iron-reinforced doors of the deliberation room remained sealed for exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes, an astonishingly brief window of time for a trial that had resurrected 33 years of historical Pacific Northwest horror, yet an agonizing eternity for the assembly of families, journalists, and legal teams anchored to the stone benches of the King County Courthouse. The steady, mechanical ticking of the wall clock seemed to double in volume with every passing minute, a rhythmic countdown toward the final, definitive resolution of the clipped-frame homicide. Inside the main gallery, the air was hot, stagnant, and heavily charged with the nervous energy of whispering reporters testing their wireless audio transmitters. When 3 sharp, metallic raps echoed from the inside of the heavy oak door, signaling that the 12 citizens of Seattle had reached a unanimous consensus, a collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a frantic, chaotic scramble for seats as court marshals flooded the well of the court. Thomas Edward Miller was wheeled back into the room by a phalanx of 4 heavily armed deputies, his frail, emaciated wrists bound in transport chains that clanked with a sharp, industrial finality. His physical appearance had undergone a subtle but terrifying transformation during the brief waiting period, the calculated, serene detachment that had served as his camouflage for over 3 decades seemed to have hardened into a frozen, unyielding mask of absolute, aristocratic defiance. He did not scan the gallery for his remaining associates, nor did he look toward his defeated defense team. He kept his chin tilted upward, his black eyes locked onto the empty jury box with the predatory intensity of an executioner waiting for a clock to strike midnight. He sat perfectly straight in his wheelchair, the soft, mechanical hum of his oxygen concentrator providing a grotesque, rhythmic soundtrack to the room's suffocating silence. District Attorney Evelyn Cross rose slowly from the prosecution table, her face an unreadable mask of absolute professional focus, though the slight, rigid tightening of her jaw revealed the profound personal weight the historic case had extracted from her team. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes tracking the 12 jurors as they filed back into the room in a slow, silent line. The jurors did not look at the defense table. Their eyes remained fixed on the floor or the judge's bench, a traditional, universal tell that sent a wave of chilling certainty through the front rows of the gallery where Claire Montgomery's younger brother sat with his knuckles turned a ghostly white. Marcus Thorne leaned over to whisper a final, administrative note into Miller's ear, but the convicted predator merely offered a faint, dismissive nod, completely rejecting the reality of his imminent legal execution. The judge cleared his throat, the sound slicing through the silence like a tactical knife. Gentlemen and ladies of the jury, have you arrived at a verdict? The foreperson, a soft-spoken high school physics teacher who had spent 3 weeks absorbing the clinical mechanics of vacuum metal deposition and historical marine geography, stood up, his hands holding a single sheet of state-issued paper that trembled slightly in his grip. "We have, Your Honor," he replied, his voice carrying a resonant, solemn weight that filled every corner of the high-ceilinged room. "On the count of first-degree kidnapping, how do you find?" The foreperson took a deep breath, looking directly at the judge. "We find the defendant, Thomas Edward Miller, guilty." A sharp, collective intake of breath echoed from the press section, but before the sound could fully materialize, the judge pressed forward. "On the count of aggravated first-degree murder, how do you find?" The foreperson paused, his eyes shifting for the first time toward the defense table, locking directly onto the weathered, unblinking face of the 58-year-old mechanic. "We find the defendant, Thomas Edward Miller, guilty as charged." The courtroom erupted into a controlled, devastating storm of human emotion. In the front row, Claire's brother dropped his head onto the wooden rail, his shoulders shaking violently as 33 years of unresolved sorrow, guilt, and agonizing silence finally collapsed into a torrent of tears. The families of Sarah Jenkins, Melissa Croft, and the other missing women from the coastal logs clung to one another in a tight, protective huddle, their faces washed with a mixture of profound, shattering grief and immense, historical vindication. Their daughters' cases had not been officially adjudicated in this specific trial, but the legal destruction of the monster who kept their stolen faces locked in his concrete vault felt like the first true step toward reclaiming their names from the dark archives of the forgotten. Flashbulbs from the media pool began firing in a rapid, blinding sequence, casting long, distorted shadows across the stone walls as reporters filed their breaking digital alerts. Through it all, Thomas Edward Miller did not move a single muscle. He sat perfectly still in his wheelchair, his black eyes still anchored on the jury box, his expression a terrifying void of complete psychological emptiness. He did not flinch, he did not rage, and he did not show a single hint of remorse. Instead, a slow, asymmetric curl appeared at the corner of his lips, a faint, condescending smirk that signaled his absolute, unyielding contempt for the system that had just condemned his flesh. To a malignant narcissist of his caliber, a guilty verdict was not a moral judgment or a declaration of his criminality. It was simply a bureaucratic error committed by a panel of inferiors who lacked the vision to understand his art. The judge slammed his gavel down with an immense, thunderous report that brought an immediate, uneasy quiet back to the room. He turned his gaze toward the defense table, his eyes burning with an intense, unvarnished disgust that had been building throughout the trial. Thomas Edward Miller, the judge stated, his voice vibrating with a powerful, authoritative resonance. You have spent the last 3 decades living an existence of unparalleled cowardice and depravity. You wrapped yourself in the oil-stained clothes of an ordinary, eccentric working man, utilizing the busy anonymity of our city's historic shipyards to camouflage a soul of absolute, unvarnished darkness. You treated independent, brilliant young women not as human beings with futures, but as raw materials for your own monstrous, perverted aesthetic fetishism, and when Claire Montgomery dared to look at the world with a vision you envied, you strangled her in the dark. The judge leaned forward over his bench, pointing his index finger directly at the convicted killer. You stood on that witness stand and told this court that you have saved these women from the passage of time by cutting their faces out of the world. Well, Mr. Miller, today the world cuts you out of its timeline. You will spend every remaining hour of your natural life inside a maximum security concrete cell, stripped of the open water, stripped of the rain, and stripped of the anonymity you used as your shield. You will be remembered not as an artist, not as a curator, but as a clinical, pathetic anomaly, a predator who was outsmarted by the very camera he tried to blind. For the crime of aggravated first-degree murder, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the remote possibility of parole. Take him away. As the deputies stepped forward to unlock his transport chains and guide his wheelchair toward the holding cell door, Miller slowly tilted his head back, looking directly at Detective Sarah Lindquist, who stood near the prosecution table. He didn't speak aloud, but his lips parted into that slow, yellow-toothed smile, his eyes flashing with a chilling, ancient malice that seemed to communicate a final, terrifying promise. The concrete cannot empty the chest, Detective. The faces are already fixed in the dark. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind him with a sharp, definitive report, marking the permanent, final end of his 40-year campaign of untouchable waterfront terror. Outside on the granite plaza of 3rd Avenue, the scene was an absolute carnival of digital journalism and public catharsis. The news of the guilty verdict had transformed the gray, drizzling Seattle afternoon into a sea of flashing emergency lights, sweeping banners, and cheering crowds. District Attorney Evelyn Cross and Detective Sarah Lindquist stepped out onto the wide steps, immediately swarmed by a dense forest of microphones, television cameras, and shouting reporters from global news desks. Cross stood before the microphones, her face pale but resolute under the glaring studio lights, her voice steady as she addressed a city that had been haunted by the phantom of East Harrison Street since the winter of 1993. Today, Cross declared, her words carrying clearly across the crowded plaza, the city of Seattle has proven that the rain does not wash away the signature of murder. 33 years ago, Thomas Edward Miller believed that his complete lack of a digital footprint, his mobile lifestyle, and his meticulous forensic cleaning placed him entirely beyond the reach of the law. He believed that by ripping the film out of a camera and waiting for the decades to pass, he could turn the execution of Claire Montgomery into a permanent, insoluble riddle. But he underestimated the power of science, and more importantly, he underestimated the unyielding determination of a community that refuses to let its daughters be forgotten. This verdict does not bring Claire back, nor does it instantly heal the deep, jagged wounds carried by the families of the other missing women whose logs we are still actively untangling. But it sends an absolute, unshakable message to every predator hiding in the industrial shadows of our communities. No matter how long you wait, no matter how deep you bury your secrets, modern science will find you, the law will catch you, and historical justice will have its sweeping day. The crowd erupted into a long, deafening roar of applause, a powerful sound that echoed through the historic brick alleys of Capitol Hill and across the gray, cold waters of Elliott Bay. The digital tickers on the massive television trucks flashed the definitive, sweeping update to the story that had gripped the nation. Seattle 1993 cold case solved. Waterfront mechanic convicted of aggravated first-degree murder. The active investigation had concluded. The trial had reached its violent psychological climax, and the legal system had delivered a crushing blow to one of the most sophisticated predators in the history of the Pacific Northwest. Yet, as the crowds began to disperse into the falling maritime dusk, a deep, unsettling silence began to settle over the lower docks where Miller had spent his life, a cold realization that the hundreds of miles of rugged, fog-enshrouded coastline he had navigated for 40 years would require a much deeper, more painful excavation before the true, terrifying scope of his secret gallery could ever be fully dragged into the light. The iron-reinforced gates of the Washington State Penitentiary at Walla Walla did not merely close behind Thomas Edward Miller. They sealed with a heavy, industrial finality that signaled the absolute eradication of his former life. The transition from the rain-slicked, neon-lit corridors of Seattle to the arid, sun-baked concrete of the state's maximum security intake facility was a violent, unyielding shock to a man who had spent more than 3 decades navigating the open waters of Puget Sound. Stripped of his oil-stained work shirts, his specialized marine tools, and his carefully cultivated aura of an eccentric harbor mechanic, inmate number 398412 stood naked in a freezing, sterile holding room. His pale, translucent skin, mapped with the blue veins of advanced age, looked ghostly under the harsh, flickering buzz of the overhead fluorescent tubes. The corrections officers did not treat him with the nervous curiosity reserved for a historical local legend. To them, he was simply a high-profile skin in an orange jumpsuit, a notorious monster whose face had saturated every digital news feed for a month, a target whose psychological survival inside the general prison population was priced at 0. The cell he was assigned to in the high-security intensive management unit was an architectural coffin measuring exactly 6 by 9 feet. The walls were constructed of solid, reinforced steel plates painted a nauseating, institutional shade of off-white, stained with the frantic, scratched-in messages of previous desperate inhabitants. A thin, fire-retardant foam mattress resting on a welded steel slab served as his bed, a stainless steel combination toilet and sink served as his amenities, and a single narrow slit of high-impact ballistic glass offered a view of nothing but a desolate, razor-wire-encrusted gravel courtyard. For a malignant narcissist whose entire psychological equilibrium depended on a constant, secret stream of absolute control and predatory superiority, this clinical void was a punishment far more devastating than any physical torture. There were no busy shipyards to observe, no vibrant young artists to stalk, no darkroom chemicals to smell in the midnight hours. There was only the steady, maddening hum of the prison's industrial ventilation system and the distant, echoing rattle of heavy iron tier doors bouncing off the concrete walls. Yet, even in the depths of this concrete purgatory, Miller's mind refused to capitulate to the reality of his permanent legal defeat. He spent his first weeks in total isolation, pacing the length of his small cell, 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, his hands locked securely behind his back in a grotesque parody of a sea captain walking the deck of his vessel during a heavy storm. He used his plastic, state-issued spoon to scratch intricate, mathematically accurate diagrams of vintage marine engines into the paint of his steel door, interspersed with specific, microscopic coordinates that matched the remote, fog-enshrouded inlets of the Pacific Northwest coastline. To the guards who monitored him through the heavy viewing port, he looked like a broken old man slowly losing his grip on sanity, but to the behavioral analysts who had studied his trial testimony, this was the terrifying preservation of his delusions. He wasn't adjusting to prison. He was converting his concrete tomb into a private laboratory of the mind, remaining entirely convinced that his aesthetic intellect was vastly superior to the system that had caged him, that the world outside was still living in a state of absolute blindness while he held the true keys to immortality. Outside the prison walls, the sweeping fallout of his conviction was tearing through the historic maritime and industrial institutions of Seattle like a slow-motion demolition. At the Elliott Bay Marina and the commercial shipyards of Ballard, a specialized independent task force formed by the State Attorney General's office commenced a highly invasive, comprehensive forensic audit of every marine repair business, storage locker, and commercial slip Miller had leased or operated since 1978. The findings, leaked to the investigative press in catastrophic waves, revealed a systemic pattern of institutional blindness and bureaucratic neglect that shook the public's trust in the waterfront regulatory systems to its very core. It emerged that over a 30-year period, more than 25 separate reports regarding Miller's bizarre behavior, his unauthorized midnight presence on private vessels, and his habit of aggressively photographing female boat owners had been systematically filed away, ignored, or dismissed by harbor authorities as the harmless eccentricities of a skilled, hard-working laborer. The civil litigation that followed the criminal verdict was a financial slaughterhouse. The families of dozens of young women who had vanished from coastal towns between Vancouver and San Diego filed multi-million-dollar wrongful death and structural negligence lawsuits against the port authorities, the marine unions, and the estate of Miller himself. The name Thomas Edward Miller, which had once been associated with a quiet, reliable craftsman who could fix any diesel engine on the Sound, had transformed into a radioactive brand, a chilling synonym for corporate complicity and monstrous serial predation. The local historical societies in Capitol Hill were forced to confront their own dark heritage, realizing that the romanticized, counterculture grunge scene of the early 1990s had been actively utilized as a private hunting safari by an outsider who viewed their entire artistic revolution through the long-range lenses of an industrial predator. While the civil courts dismantled his financial remnants, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was quietly working to unravel the true, terrifying dimensions of his secret criminal legacy. Detective Sarah Lindquist, who had refused to close her notebook after the King County verdict, had been formally embedded with a federal task force tasked with mapping the contents of the Grizzlies' journals against national databases of unsolved homicides. She sat in a secure, climate-controlled office at the federal building in downtown Seattle, surrounded by the digitized scans of Miller's tight, microscopic script. She knew that the photographs recovered from the Eagle Wharf bait shop represented only the trophies he considered perfect. The journals suggested a much larger, darker orbit of operational activity that extended far beyond the borders of Washington state. The data mapping produced a horrifying, jagged trail of blood that traced the exact movements of Miller's mobile repair business up and down the Pacific Coast Highway. Everywhere his logs recorded a major mechanical contract, a commercial fishing boat overhaul in Astoria, Oregon, a yacht restoration in Monterey, California, a diesel pump repair in Ketchikan, Alaska. A localized spike in the disappearances of independent young women occurred within a 5-mile radius of his registered workplace or transit lodging. The methodology was chillingly consistent. Victims vanishing into the maritime fog on stormy winter nights, their vehicles found abandoned near public transit hubs with no signs of struggle, their bodies either never recovered or discovered